long after the storm fades. So put on your headphones, turn off the lights, and listen closely, because the rain hides more than you think. These are scary night horror stories with rain sound. Our first story is titled, The Radio That Knows When You'll Die, written by Harper Gray. The old Philco radio sat in the corner of the antique shop like a patient predator, its mahogany cabinet gleaming despite decades of neglect. Marcus Wellington had walked past it 3 times before the proprietor, an elderly man with clouded eyes, approached him. "That one's been here longer than I care to remember," the old man wheezed. Previous owner said it still works perfectly. Never could get anyone to buy it, though. Marcus ran his fingers along the smooth wood grain. Something about the radio called to him. Perhaps it was the intricate craftsmanship, or the way the afternoon light seemed to avoid its surface entirely. "How much?" "Take it. Free of charge. Been taking up space for too long." That evening in his apartment in downtown Toronto, Marcus plugged the radio into the wall. The tubes inside glowed amber as it hummed to life. He turned the dial, expecting static or perhaps a distant station, but instead heard only silence. Then, as if emerging from a great depth, a voice began to speak. Marcus Wellington of 412 Queen Street West will October 11:47 p.m. Cardiac error. His blood turned to ice. The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It possessed an otherworldly quality that seemed to bypass his ears and speak directly into his skull. Marcus lunged for the power button, but the radio had already fallen silent. Sleep eluded him that night. October 15th was 3 weeks away. He tried to convince himself it was a prank, maybe some kind of sophisticated technology he didn't understand. But deep in his gut, he knew this was something else entirely. The next morning, Marcus called his doctor and scheduled a complete physical. Dr. Patricia Hayes found nothing wrong. His heart was strong, blood pressure normal, no family history of cardiac problems. Yet the radio's prediction echoed in his mind like a death sentence. Days passed. Marcus found himself checking the calendar obsessively, counting down to October 15th. He tried to stay away from the radio, but it drew him back each evening like a moth to flame. Every night at exactly 9 p.m., it would crackle to life. Janet Morrison of Melbourne will die on November 3rd at 2:15 a.m. Cause of death: drowning in her bathtub after suffering a seizure. David Clark of Vancouver will experience fatal brain aneurysm on December 1st at 6:33 p.m. while watching television. Rebecca Torres of Sydney will die January 8th at 4:12 a.m. when her apartment building catches fire due to faulty wiring. Each prediction was delivered in that same emotionless tone. Marcus began researching the names online, finding social media profiles, news articles, anything that could prove these people existed. Janet Morrison was a real estate agent in Melbourne. David Clark taught high school in Vancouver. Rebecca Torres worked as a nurse in Sydney. October 10th arrived. 5 days left. Marcus had barely eaten in weeks, surviving on coffee and nervous energy. His hands shook constantly. He considered destroying the radio, but something held him back, a morbid fascination with his own doom. That night, the radio delivered a prediction that made his heart stop. Thomas Reed of Ottawa will die tomorrow, October 11th, at 3:26 p.m. Cause of death: automobile accident on Highway 417. Marcus frantically searched for Thomas Reed online. There he was, a construction worker with a wife and 2 young children. His social media showed a happy family man who posted pictures of weekend camping trips and Little League games. Marcus grabbed his phone and called the Ottawa police. "I need to report someone in danger," he said, his voice cracking. "Thomas Reed. He lives on." Marcus realized he only had the man's name and general location. The officer was polite but dismissive. Without specific information, there was nothing they could do about a feeling that someone might be in danger. The next day, Marcus obsessively refreshed news websites. At 4:17 p.m., the headline appeared: Ottawa man killed in Highway 417 collision. The article identified the victim as Thomas Reed, age 34, who died instantly when his pickup truck was struck by a semi-trailer at 3:26 p.m. The room spun around Marcus. His hands trembled so violently he could barely hold his phone. The radio's prediction had come true down to the exact minute. October 12th, October 13th, October 14th. Each day crawled by like a lifetime. Marcus couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think of anything but his approaching death. He considered fleeing the city, but the radio had found him somehow. Distance wouldn't matter. October 15th dawned gray and cold. Marcus spent the day in his apartment, every nerve ending on fire. He'd thrown the radio into his closet, but he could still feel its presence like a malignant tumor in his home. As evening approached, his terror reached a crescendo. Every shadow seemed to move with malicious intent. Every sound made him jump. The walls of his apartment felt like they were closing in. At 11:30 p.m., he was pacing the living room, checking his watch every few seconds. 17 minutes left. 16. 15. Sudden silence fell over the building. The hum of the refrigerator stopped. The distant traffic noise faded. Even his own heartbeat seemed muffled in this unnatural quiet. He heard it, the radio crackling to life from inside the closet. 12 minutes remaining. Marcus pressed his back against the wall, hyperventilating. This couldn't be happening. Death couldn't be scheduled like a doctor's appointment. 8 minutes remaining. His heart hammered against his ribs like a caged animal. Sweat poured down his face despite the cool air. The apartment felt smaller, darker, as if reality itself was contracting around him. 4 minutes remaining. The voice seemed closer now, not just coming from the closet, but surrounding him, pressing in from all sides. Marcus clutched his chest as pain shot through his left arm. His vision blurred at the edges. 2 minutes remaining. He collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. The pain in his chest was unbearable now, a crushing weight that made each heartbeat an agony. Through his failing vision, he saw something impossible. Closet door slowly creaking open. 1 minute remaining. The radio sat visible now in the darkness of the closet, its amber tubes pulsing like dying stars. But something else was there too. A shadow that shouldn't exist. A presence that defied comprehension. 30 seconds remaining. Marcus tried to scream, but only a whisper escaped his lips. The shadow began to take shape, tall and impossibly thin, with eyes that weren't eyes but holes in reality itself. 10 seconds remaining. His heart seized in his chest like a fist clenching. The shadow figure stepped out of the closet, and Marcus finally understood. The radio didn't predict death, it summoned it. Time's up. The last thing Marcus Wellington saw was the figure reaching toward him, with fingers like broken branches. His heart exploded in his chest at exactly 11:47 p.m., October 15th, just as the radio had promised. The next morning, his landlord found him on the living room floor, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest. The radio sat silent in the closet, already knowing its next victim. Within a week, it appeared in another antique shop across town, waiting patiently for someone new to take it home. After all, death is a patient collector, and the radio never lies about its appointments. The cycle continues, and somewhere tonight, someone is hearing their name called by that terrible, emotionless voice, learning the exact moment their world will end. Because some antiques carry more than just history, they carry hunger. The rain hammered against the windows of Maple Street like bullets from heaven, each drop exploding into 1,000 fragments against the glass. Toronto had seen its share of storms, but this one felt different. This one felt hungry. Rebecca Morrison pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders as she watched the lightning illuminate the empty street beyond her living room window. The storm had been raging for 3 hours now, and the power had flickered twice. She lived alone in the old Victorian house she had inherited from her grandmother, and nights like these made her acutely aware of every creak, every whisper of wind through the ancient woodwork. The meteorologist on the emergency radio had warned of severe weather, but Rebecca had weathered worse storms in this house. What he hadn't mentioned was the stories, the local legends that the old-timers whispered about when storms like this rolled through the city. Stories about the woman who walks during thunderstorms. Rebecca had first heard the tale from Emrys, Henley next door, an elderly woman whose family had lived in the neighborhood for 4 generations. According to the legend, during the worst storms, a soaked woman would appear on the streets, walking from house to house. She would knock on windows, her face pale and desperate, begging to be let in from the cold rain. But those who answered her plea, those who opened their doors to offer shelter, were never seen again. The rational part of Rebecca's mind dismissed it as nonsense. Old wives' tales meant to frighten children into staying indoors during dangerous weather. But as the storm intensified, as the thunder shook the very foundations of her house, she found herself thinking about Emrys, Henley's words. "She only comes during the worst storms," the old woman had whispered, her eyes distant and afraid. "When the rain falls hard enough to wash away footprints, when the thunder drowns out screams, that's when she walks." Another flash of lightning turned the world outside stark white for a moment, and Rebecca thought she saw something move in the street. A figure, perhaps, walking slowly through the torrential downpour. But when the lightning faded and her eyes readjusted to the darkness, there was nothing there but rain and shadow. She told herself it was her imagination, the product of Emrys, Henley's frightening stories, and her own isolation. Rebecca had always been prone to anxiety during storms, ever since she was a child. The violent weather reminded her too much of the night her parents had died, caught in a flash flood while driving home from a dinner party. The authorities had found their car 3 days later, wrapped around a tree in River Valley Park. Their bodies never recovered. The radio crackled with static, then fell silent. Rebecca reached over to adjust the antenna, but the device remained dead. The power flickered again, this time staying off for nearly 30 seconds before humming back to life. During those moments of darkness, the house felt different somehow, as if something had changed in the brief absence of light. That's when she heard it. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was barely audible over the storm, but it was unmistakably deliberate. 3 soft knocks, coming from somewhere downstairs. Rebecca froze, her hand still on the radio antenna, listening intently. For a long moment, there was nothing but the thunder and rain. Then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. This time she was certain. Someone was knocking on her front door. Rebecca's heart began to race. Who would be out in weather like this? The storm was dangerous, with wind strong enough to knock down trees and rain heavy enough to flood the streets. No rational person would be walking around in conditions like these. She crept to the top of the stairs, trying to peer down into the darkened hallway below. The front door was barely visible from her position, just a darker rectangle against the shadows. Lightning flashed again, briefly illuminating the stained glass panel above the door, casting colored shadows across the hardwood floor. The knocking came a third time, more insistent now. Tap, tap, tap. Rebecca descended the stairs slowly, each step creaking under her weight, despite her attempts to move quietly. As she reached the bottom, she could hear something else over the storm. A voice, faint and muffled by the heavy wooden door. "Please," the voice called out, barely audible. It sounded like a woman, young and, "Please, I need help. I'm so cold." Rebecca approached the door, cleats floor. She was, "I won't cause any trouble. I just need to get out of the rain." Against her better judgment, Rebecca found herself reaching for the door handle. The woman sounded genuinely distressed. And what kind of person would she be if she left someone out in a storm like this? But as her hand touched the cool metal, Emrys, Henley's words echoed in her mind. "Those who answer her plea are never seen again." Rebecca pulled her hand back as if the handle had burned her. She pressed her ear to the door instead, listening carefully. The woman's voice came again, but this time something about it seemed off. The tone was the same, the words were the same, but there was an odd quality to it, as if the voice was being played back from a recording. "Please." The voice repeated, exactly as before. Please, I need help. I'm so cold. Word for word, inflection for inflection. It was identical to what she had heard moments before. Rebecca stepped away from the door, her skin crawling with sudden fear. No human voice was that consistent, that precisely repeated. She hurried to the living room window that faced the front porch, carefully pulling back the heavy curtain just enough to peer outside. The porch light was still on, casting a small circle of yellow illumination through the rain. But the porch was empty. There was no one there. Rebecca stared in disbelief. The knocking had come from the front door. She was certain of it. The voice had been right there, on the other side of the wooden barrier. But the covered porch showed no signs of occupation. No wet footprints. No figure huddled against the storm. She was about to let the curtain fall back into place when movement in the street caught her eye. A figure was walking slowly down Maple Street, moving through the rain as if it were nothing more than a light mist. The figure was that of a woman, dressed in what appeared to be a long, dark coat that clung to her thin frame. Her hair hung in wet strands around her face, and her movements were slow and deliberate. As Rebecca watched, frozen with a mixture of fascination and dread, the woman turned to look directly at her window. Even through the rain and darkness, Rebecca could see her face clearly. The woman's skin was pale, almost luminescent in the storm light, and her eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire visible eye, as if there were holes in her face leading to some vast emptiness. The woman smiled, and Rebecca saw that her teeth were too sharp, too numerous, filling her mouth like broken glass. She raised one hand in a small wave, her fingers long, and ending in what looked like claws rather than nails. Rebecca stumbled backward from a window, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She grabbed her cell phone with shaking hands and dialed 911, but the call wouldn't go through. The storm must have knocked out the cell towers. She tried the landline next, but that was dead too. She was completely alone. The knocking started again, but this time it wasn't coming from the front door. The sound was coming from the kitchen, from the back door that led to her small garden. Rebecca stood in the center of her living room, paralyzed with terror as the knocking moved around her house. First the back door, then the side window, then what sounded like the basement entrance. Tap, tap, tap. Each knock was followed by the same pleading voice, but now Rebecca could hear it coming from multiple directions at once, as if there were several women outside, all speaking in perfect unison. Please, I need help. I'm so cold. The voices seemed to be getting closer, though that was impossible. The doors were all locked, the windows were all secure, but with each repetition, the words sounded as if they were coming from just inside the house rather than outside. Rebecca ran upstairs to her bedroom, slamming the door behind her and turning the lock. She grabbed her grandmother's old rocking chair and shoved it under the door handle for good measure. The bedroom window overlooked the backyard, and she cautiously approached it to peer outside. The woman was standing directly below her window, looking up. In the brief illumination of a lightning flash, Rebecca could see that she was smiling that terrible smile, and her black eyes seemed to reflect the light like those of a nocturnal animal. But that was impossible. The bedroom was on the second floor, at least 15 feet above the ground. The woman would have to be floating to appear that close to the window. As Rebecca watched in horror, the woman began to rise. Slowly, impossibly, she ascended through the air until she was level with the bedroom window. Her feet didn't touch the ground, yet she remained perfectly stable despite the violent winds. She pressed her face against the glass, her breath fogging the window despite the fact that she was outside in the cold rain. Please, she whispered, and this time Rebecca could hear her clearly despite the glass barrier. I need help. I'm so cold. Rebecca backed away from the window, but there was nowhere to go. The woman's black eyes followed her movement, and her smile widened until it seemed to split her face in half. She raised one clawed hand and tapped gently on the glass. Tap, tap, tap. The sound echoed through the bedroom like gunshots. Rebecca pressed herself against the far wall, her mind reeling with terror and disbelief. This couldn't be happening. People didn't float outside second-story windows. People didn't have eyes like black holes and teeth like broken glass. But the woman was there, undeniably real, tapping on the window with increasing urgency. Her voice had changed now, becoming less human with each word. "Let me in," she hissed, and her voice sounded like steam escaping from a boiling kettle. "Let me in, and I'll make the pain stop. I'll make everything stop." Rebecca closed her eyes and pressed her hands over her ears, trying to block out the sight and sound of the impossible woman. But even with her eyes closed, she could still sense the presence outside the window. A cold, hungry presence that seemed to drain warmth from the very air. When she opened her eyes again, the woman was gone. Rebecca stayed pressed against the wall for what felt like hours, but when she finally found the courage to approach the window, the backyard was empty. The storm was beginning to subside, the thunder growing more distant, the rain lessening from a torrent to a steady downpour. She spent the rest of the night huddled in her bedroom, the chair still barricaded against the door. Every small sound made her jump. Every creak of the old house made her heart race. But there were no more knocks, no more voices pleading for entry. When dawn finally broke, gray and overcast, but blessedly normal, Rebecca ventured downstairs. Everything appeared exactly as she had left it. The doors were still locked, the windows still secure. There were no wet footprints on her floors, no signs that anyone had been inside. She almost managed to convince herself that it had all been a nightmare, a product of her imagination and Emrys, Henley's frightening stories. Almost. But when she went to make coffee that morning, she found something that made her blood run cold. On her kitchen window, the one that faced the backyard, were 3 small marks in the glass. They were barely visible, just tiny scratches that caught the light at certain angles. They looked like they had been made by fingernails or claws. Rebecca packed a bag that very morning and left for her sister's house in Vancouver. She told her sister that she needed a change of scenery, that the old house held too many memories. She didn't mention the woman who walked during thunderstorms, didn't speak of black eyes and impossible smiles, but she never returned to Maple Street. 6 months later, the house was sold to a young couple from Edmonton. The real estate agent mentioned that the previous owner had left quite suddenly, but didn't elaborate. The couple was charmed by the Victorian architecture and the tree-lined street. They moved in during the summer, when the weather was warm and clear. They were happy there for several months. The husband set up a workshop in the basement. The wife planted a garden in the backyard. They made friends with the neighbors, including Emrys, Henley next door, who seemed pleased to have young people in the old house again. Everything was perfect until the first major storm of autumn. The couple was found 3 days later by the postal worker, who had noticed that their mail was piling up. The front door was wide open, swinging in the wind. Inside, the house was undisturbed except for 2 things. All the windows had been opened, and there were wet footprints leading from each window to the center of the living room, where they formed a strange pattern on the hardwood floor. The couple was never found. The police investigated, of course, but there were no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. They had simply vanished, leaving behind all their possessions and no indication of where they might have gone. Emrys, Henley wasn't surprised. She had lived long enough to see this pattern before. The house on Maple Street had a history, though most people preferred not to talk about it. Every few years, someone would move in, drawn by the beautiful architecture and reasonable price. And every few years, during the worst storms, they would disappear. The house sits empty now, a for sale sign slowly weathering in the front yard. Real estate agents have given up showing it, though they can't quite explain why. Potential buyers often express interest until they visit during a storm. Then, for reasons they can't articulate, they change their minds. But Emrys, Henley still watches from her window during thunderstorms. She still sees the woman walking slowly down Maple Street, moving from house to house, knocking on windows with her terrible clawed fingers. Most people have learned not to answer. Most people have heard the stories. But every so often, someone new moves to the neighborhood. Someone who doesn't know the local legends, who dismisses them as nonsense. And when the storms come, when the rain falls hard enough to wash away footprints and the thunder drowns out screams, they hear the knocking. And sometimes, despite all the warnings, despite all their rational thoughts, they answer. The woman who walks during thunderstorms is always looking for new company, always searching for someone willing to open their door, to invite her in from the cold rain. And once you let her in, once you see her true face in the warm light of your home, you understand the truth. She isn't looking for shelter from the storm. She is the storm, and she's been waiting for you to join her in the rain forever. The sirens wailed across Denver, Colorado, like banshees announcing the end of the world. Marcus Wright pressed his foot harder against the accelerator, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The radio crackled with emergency broadcasts, the meteorologist's voice barely audible through the static. Unprecedented F5 tornado. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. Through his rearview mirror, Marcus could see the massive wall cloud rolling across the plains, a churning black mass that seemed to devour everything in its path. He had been driving back from a business trip when the storm hit, and now he was caught in the open with nowhere to go. The wind began to rock his car violently. Debris flew past his windshield, pieces of roof, tree branches, what looked like someone's mailbox. He needed shelter, and he needed it now. That's when he saw it, just off the highway, partially hidden by a cluster of dead cottonwood trees, stood what appeared to be a concrete structure. It looked old, weathered, with a heavy metal door that had rusted around the edges. Without hesitation, Marcus yanked the steering wheel and drove straight toward it. He abandoned his car and ran through the howling wind, his clothes whipping around him like flags in a hurricane. The metal door was heavy, but desperation gave him strength. It groaned open on corroded hinges, revealing a set of concrete steps descending into darkness. Marcus stumbled down the steps just as the tornado's roar became deafening overhead. He slammed the door shut behind him, and suddenly, everything was silent. He fumbled for his phone's flashlight, the pale glow revealing a small underground chamber. The walls were concrete, stained with decades of moisture and decay. The air was thick and stale, carrying a smell that made his stomach turn, something sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in water. As his eyes adjusted, he realized this wasn't just any shelter. It was a fallout shelter, probably built during the Cold War. Metal shelving lined the walls, filled with dusty cans and supplies that looked untouched for decades. In the corner sat a small cot with a moldy blanket, and beside it, an old wooden table. And on that table lay a journal. Marcus approached slowly, his footsteps echoing in the confined space. The leather cover was cracked and faded, bound with what looked like a shoelace. His hands trembled as he opened it to the first page. Property of David Henley, Omaha, Nebraska. If found, please contact authorities. Started March 15th, 1987. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground temperature. 1987. That was almost 40 years ago. He flipped to the first entry. Day 1, March 15th, 1987. The tornado came out of nowhere. I was driving through Nebraska when I saw this old shelter. The door slammed shut behind me, and now I can't get it open. The handle is broken on the inside. I'm trying not to panic. Someone will find me soon. Marcus looked back at the door he had just come through. The handle was there, old but functional. He had just used it, but as he examined it more closely in the dim light, he noticed scratch marks all around it, deep gouges in the metal, as if someone had clawed at it desperately. He continued reading. Day 3, March 17th, 1987. Still no rescue. I've been rationing the food I've found here, but it's mostly canned goods from the 1960s. Some of it might still be good. The water tastes strange, metallic. I keep hearing sounds above ground, but when I call out, no one answers. Maybe they can't hear me through the concrete. Day 7, March 21st, 1987. The sounds have stopped. I think the storm passed days ago, but I'm still trapped. I've tried everything to get the door open. I even tried to dig through the walls with a can opener, but the concrete is too thick. My fingernails are bleeding from clawing at the door. Why won't anyone find me? Marcus felt his breathing become shallow. He looked around the shelter again, noticing details he had missed before. There were indeed scratch marks on the walls, and what looked like dark stains on the concrete floor near the door. Day 12, March 26, 1987. I'm getting weaker. The canned food makes me sick, but I have to eat something. I found an old battery-powered radio, but all I get is static. Sometimes I think I hear voices in the static, calling my name, but that's impossible. I must be going crazy from being alone down here. Day 18, April 1st, 1987. Something is wrong with this place. I keep finding things that weren't here before. Today I found a photograph on the floor. A picture of a family I don't recognize. Where did it come from? And the smell is getting worse. It's not just the old food anymore. It smells like something died down here. Marcus's hands were shaking as he turned the pages. The handwriting was becoming increasingly erratic, the letters uneven and desperate. Day 25, April 8th, 1987. I'm not alone. I thought I was, but I'm not. I hear breathing in the walls. Sometimes I see shadows moving in the corners, but when I shine the flashlight, nothing is there. The photograph keeps appearing in different places. Today it was on my pillow. The family in the picture looks familiar now. I think one of them might be me. Marcus dropped the journal and stumbled backward. In the pale light of his phone, he could see something white on the floor near his feet. He bent down and picked it up. It was a photograph. The image showed a family of 4 standing in front of a house. A man, woman, and 2 children, all smiling. But the man's face. Marcus held up his phone light to get a better look. The man looked exactly like him. With trembling hands, he picked up the journal again. Day 31, April 14th, 1987. I understand now. This isn't just a shelter. It's a trap. Others have been here before me. I found their bones behind the shelving. 3 skeletons wearing clothes from different decades. One had a wallet. The ID said his name was Thomas Wright. Same last name as mine. Same face too, according to the photo. Marcus's phone clattered to the floor. Wright was his last name. Thomas Wright. Could that be his grandfather? The grandfather who had disappeared during a business trip in the 1960s, whose body was never found. Day 40, April 23rd, 1987. The voices in the walls are getting louder. They're calling my name now, telling me to join them. I think they're the others who were trapped here. Thomas keeps appearing to me. Tells me that our family is cursed to find this place. That we're drawn here, generation after generation. He says the shelter feeds on us. Keeps us here. I tried to burn the journal today, to break whatever hold this place has, but the matches won't light. Nothing works here. Nothing except the hunger. I haven't eaten in days, but I'm not dying. I should be dead by now, but something is keeping me alive, keeping me trapped. The flashlight on Marcus's phone flickered and went out. In the sudden darkness, he heard something that made his blood freeze. Breathing, not his own. He frantically tried to restart his phone, but the screen remained black. In the absolute darkness of the underground shelter, he could hear movement all around him. Shuffling footsteps, whispered voices. Marcus. The voice was right beside his ear, but when he spun around, his hands found only empty air. Marcus, you've come home. He fumbled in his pockets for anything. Keys, a lighter, anything that could provide light. His fingers closed around a book of matches he had forgotten about. With shaking hands, he struck one. The tiny flame illuminated the shelter, and Marcus screamed. They were all there, standing in a circle around him. 3 figures in various stages of decay, their clothes from different eras. A man in a 1960s suit, his face gaunt and hollow. A woman in 1970s clothing, her eyes black holes in a skull-like face. And standing directly in front of him, David Henley, still wearing the clothes he had died in 40 years ago. The journal clutched against his chest. Your turn to write, David whispered, his voice like wind through dry leaves. The match burned down to Marcus's fingers, and he dropped it with a cry of pain. In the renewed darkness, cold hands grabbed him from all sides. He felt the journal being pressed into his hands. felt something sharp being placed between his fingers. A pen. When his phone's light finally flickered back to life, Marcus found himself sitting at the wooden table. The journal was open to a fresh page, and his hand was already moving, writing words he hadn't consciously formed. Day 1, July 20th, 2025. Property of Marcus Wright. Denver, Colorado. The tornado came out of nowhere. Above ground, the storm had passed. The sun was beginning to set over the Colorado plains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red. Emergency crews would find his abandoned car in the morning, but they would never think to look for the old fallout shelter hidden among the dead trees. The shelter that appeared only during storms. The shelter that fed on the Wright family bloodline. The shelter that would wait patiently for the next generation to find their way home. In the darkness below, Marcus continued to write, his hand moving by itself across the page. Behind him, the other trapped souls watched and waited, knowing that his words would eventually fill the journal, just as theirs had. And when the journal was full, when Marcus had written his last entry, the shelter would be ready for the next visitor, another member of the cursed bloodline who would inevitably find their way here during the next storm. The cycle would continue, as it had for generations, as it would for generations to come. Day 365, July 19th, 2026. I can't remember what the sun looks like anymore. My hands are starting to look like theirs now, thin and pale. The others tell me it's almost time. Time for me to join them in the walls, to wait for the next one to find this place. I can hear him already, even though he hasn't been born yet. My nephew, Jacob Wright. He'll be here in about 20 years, during the great storm of 2045. I can see it all now, the way they see everything. Time moves differently here. Past, present, and future all blend together in the darkness. If anyone finds this journal, if anyone reads these words, know this. The Wright family shelter is real. We built it ourselves generations ago, thinking we were creating a safe haven. Instead, we created a prison. A hungry prison that calls to our blood. Don't look for us. Don't try to save us. Just pray that your last name isn't Wright. The journal entry ended there, the final page filled. In the darkness of the shelter, for voices now whispered from the walls, waiting for the next storm to bring them company. And somewhere in Denver, a young couple named Jacob and Sarah Wright welcomed their newborn son into the world, unaware of the inheritance that waited for him in an underground tomb. The storm was coming. It was always coming. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Derek Thompson first heard his own voice screaming from somewhere deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains. He froze on a muddy trail, his hiking boots squelching in saturated earth, listening to the impossible sound echoing through the pine trees. "Help me. Somebody help me." The voice was unmistakably his own, tinged with terror and desperation, coming from at least a mile deeper into the forest. Derek's hiking partner, Michael Carter from Vancouver, stopped beside him, rain dripping from the brim of his waterproof hat. "Did you hear that?" "You heard it too," Derek whispered, his breath forming small clouds in the cold mountain air. The scream came again, fainter this time, but still carrying that horrifying familiarity. It was Derek's voice, pleading for rescue from somewhere in the impenetrable darkness between the trees. They had been hiking the Appalachian Trail for 2 weeks, making their way through Virginia's most remote sections. The constant rain had turned what should have been a challenging but manageable trek into a nightmare of mud, swollen streams, and limited visibility. Most other hikers had abandoned their trips days ago, but Derek and Michael were experienced outdoorsmen from Calgary who prided themselves on pushing through difficult conditions. Now, standing in the drumming rain, they questioned that decision. "Maybe it's an echo," Michael suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. "Sound travels weird in these mountains." Derek shook his head. "I haven't said anything in the last hour." And that voice, it was screaming for help. They stood in silence, straining to hear anything beyond the steady percussion of rain on leaves. The forest around them seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as if the very trees were listening, waiting. That night, they made camp in a small clearing, their tent barely large enough for 2 people. The rain continued its relentless assault, turning the ground beneath them into a soggy mess that soaked through their sleeping bags despite the waterproof floor. Derek lay awake, staring at the tent ceiling as water found impossible ways to seep through their gear. Every sound outside made him tense. The crack of a branch, the rustle of wet leaves, the distant call of night birds. But it was the silence between sounds that truly unnerved him. Around 2 a.m., he heard it again. "Michael, Michael, where are you?" The voice was his own, but filled with panic and confusion. It seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if the forest itself was calling out with his voice. Michael jerked awake beside him. What the hell was that? "My voice," Derek whispered. "It's calling for you." They unzipped their tent flap and peered into the rain-soaked darkness. The beam from Derek's flashlight barely penetrated 10 feet into the wall of precipitation and shadow that surrounded their small camp. "Michael, I can't find you. Help me." The voice came again, closer now, filled with a desperation that made Derek's skin crawl. "That's impossible," Michael muttered. "You're right here." But as the words left his mouth, they heard another voice join the chorus, Michael's own voice, calling from somewhere in the depths of the forest. "Derek, don't leave me. I'm lost." The 2 men stared at each other in the dim light of their flashlight, rain drumming against their tent like fingertips tapping on a coffin lid. "We need to get out of here," Michael said, his usual confidence replaced by fear. "First light, we head back to the main trail." But sleep, when it finally came, brought no relief. Derek found himself walking through the forest in his dreams, following a trail that seemed familiar yet wrong. The trees were too tall, their branches reaching down like gnarled fingers. The rain fell upward, defying gravity, and in the distance he could hear voices calling. His own voice, Michael's voice, and others he didn't recognize. He followed the sounds deeper into the dream forest, past landmarks that shouldn't exist. There was a cabin made of bones, its windows glowing with sickly yellow light. A stream ran backward, carrying leaves and debris toward its source. And everywhere, the voices continued their desperate chorus, calling out names and pleading for help that would never come. When he woke, dawn was breaking gray and cold through the rain clouds. Michael was already awake, sitting up in his sleeping bag with wide, bloodshot eyes. "I heard them all night," Michael said without preamble. "Dozens of voices. All of them sounded like us." They packed their gear in silence, fingers numb from cold and fear. The plan was simple: retrace their steps back to the main trail and get off the mountain as quickly as possible. But as they shouldered their packs and prepared to leave their campsite, Derek noticed something that made his blood run cold. There were footprints in the mud around their tent. Fresh prints, made sometime during the night while they slept. The prints matched their own boots exactly, the same size, the same tread pattern, the same distinctive wear marks. But there were too many of them, going in directions they had never walked. "Michael," Derek called softly, pointing to the ground. His partner followed his gaze and cursed under his breath. The prints formed a rough circle around their tent, as if multiple versions of themselves had stood guard throughout the night. They left the clearing quickly, not looking back, but Derek couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Every few minutes he would glance over his shoulder, expecting to see their own faces staring back from between the trees. The trail back should have been straightforward. They had marked their route carefully on the way in, but nothing looked right. Landmarks they remembered seemed shifted, rotated, or missing entirely. A distinctive rock formation that had served as a waypoint was now on the wrong side of the trail. A stream they had crossed the day before now flowed in the opposite direction. "We're going the right way, aren't we?" Michael asked, consulting his GPS device for the 10th time in an hour. Derek checked his own navigation equipment, but the readings made no sense. According to the GPS, they were in 3 different locations simultaneously, none of which matched their paper maps. As they walked, the voices grew stronger. Sometimes they seemed to come from just ahead, around the next bend in the trail. Other times they echoed from behind, as if following their footsteps. Always, they were their own voices, calling out in fear and desperation. "I think I see the problem," Michael said suddenly, pointing ahead to where the trail split into 3 directions. "This fork wasn't here yesterday." Derek stared at the diverging paths. He was certain they had come through this area, but he couldn't remember any split in the trail. One path led uphill toward what looked like thick underbrush. Another descended sharply into a ravine filled with mist. The third seemed to curve back on itself, disappearing into a grove of dead trees. "Which way?" Michael asked. Before Derek could answer, they heard footsteps approaching from behind. Heavy boots on wet ground, moving with the steady rhythm of experienced hikers. They turned to see 2 figures emerging from mist, 2 men in rain gear, carrying packs identical to their own. As the figures drew closer, Derek felt reality tilt and shift around him. The approaching hikers had their faces, exact duplicates, down to the 3-day stubble on Derek's jaw and the small scar above Michael's left eyebrow. The duplicate Derek raised his hand in greeting, a friendly smile on his familiar features. "Hey there, you guys seen any other hikers come through here? We're looking for our friends." "Friends?" Michael managed to croak. "Yeah," the duplicate Michael replied. "Derek and Michael, from Calgary. We got separated yesterday, and we've been hearing them calling for help." The original Derek and Michael backed away slowly, their minds struggling to process what they were seeing. The duplicates seemed genuinely friendly, even concerned, but something was terribly wrong with their eyes. They were too bright, too knowing, like pools of dark water reflecting hidden depths. "You haven't seen them, have you?" Duplicate Derek asked again, taking a step closer. "We really need to find them. They sound scared." We are them," Derek whispered. The duplicates tilted their heads in perfect synchronization, their smiles never wavering. No, Duplicate Michael said. "You're confused. Derek and Michael went that way." He pointed toward the path leading into the dead trees. "We heard them calling from down there just a few minutes ago." As if summoned by his words, voices began echoing from the indicated direction. Multiple voices, all variations of Derek and Michael, calling out in terror and confusion. "Help us. We're trapped. The trail just keeps going deeper. There's no way out. Something's following us." The duplicates began walking toward the sound, gesturing for the originals to follow. "Come on," Duplicate Derek said. "They need our help." But Derek and Michael were already running, crashing through the underbrush in their desperation to escape. Behind them, they could hear their duplicates calling after them in voices that grew less human with each word. "Derek, Michael, don't leave us. We just want to help." They ran without direction, following game trails and deer paths that seemed to shift and change as they moved. The forest grew denser around them, the canopy so thick that day turned to twilight even though it was barely noon. The rain continued to fall, but it seemed different now, thicker, almost syrupy, with a metallic taste that clung to their lips. Eventually, exhaustion forced them to stop. They found themselves in a small clearing dominated by a massive oak tree, its trunk so wide that 10 men holding hands couldn't encircle it. The tree was ancient, its bark scarred and blackened as if it had been struck by lightning countless times. "Where are we?" Michael gasped, leaning against the oak's trunk. Derek pulled out his GPS, but the screen showed only static. His compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. "I don't know." As they caught their breath, they became aware of sounds coming from within the tree itself. Muffled voices, barely audible through the thick bark. The voices were calling for help, using their names, speaking in their voices. Michael pressed his ear against the trunk. "There's something inside," he whispered. "People inside the tree." Derek joined him, placing his hands flat against the rough bark. The wood was warm to the touch, pulsing with a rhythm that felt disturbingly like a heartbeat. The voices inside grew more distinct, and he recognized not just his own voice and Michael's, but others as well, men and women, young and old, all calling out from within their wooden prison. "How long have they been in there?" Derek wondered aloud. His question was answered by a new voice. one that spoke from the base of the tree. They looked down to see a face emerging from the root system, an old man's weathered features pushing through the bark like a bas-relief carving. "Years," the face said, its voice rustling like autumn leaves. "Some of us have been here for years. Others just arrived. Time doesn't work the same way in here." "What is this place?" Michael asked. The face in the bark smiled sadly. "A trap, a collection point. The forest gathers echoes of people who wander too far from the path. It keeps them, studies them, learns from them." "Echoes," Derek repeated. "You heard your own voices calling, didn't you?" Those were echoes the forest made, using pieces it had captured from other travelers. It uses them to lure more people deeper into the woods, away from safety. Derek felt sick. The duplicates we saw. More echoes. Improved versions, based on the patterns it has learned. The forest is getting better at copying people. Soon, its echoes will be perfect enough to leave the woods and walk among the living. The face began to sink back into the bark. "Run now while you still can. Don't trust anything you see or hear. And whatever you do, don't let the forest take your voices. Once it has those, it has everything it needs." Derek and Michael didn't need to be told twice. They fled the clearing, the old man's warnings echoing in their ears. But as they ran, they realized the horrible truth. They had been leaving their voices behind all along. Every word they spoke, every sound they made, was being absorbed by the forest around them. The trees seemed to lean closer as they passed, branches reaching down like fingers, trying to pluck words from their lips. The rain fell harder, washing away their footprints and any hope of retracing their steps. Hours passed in a blur of desperate flight. They spoke only when absolutely necessary, communicating mostly through gestures and nods. But even their silence wasn't safe. The forest seemed to be learning from their breathing, their heartbeats, the rhythm of their footsteps on wet ground. As darkness fell, they found themselves back at the three-way fork in the trail. But now there were dozens of paths branching off in every direction, and standing at each junction were duplicates of themselves, all smiling that too bright smile, all gesturing for them to come closer. "This way, Derek. This way, Michael. We found a way out." "Don't trust them," duplicate Derek called to them. "Those aren't the real paths. Follow us. He's lying." Another duplicate Michael insisted. "We're real friends. We've been looking for you." The chorus of their own voices rose around them, each duplicate claiming to be genuine, each offering salvation that felt like a trap. Derek grabbed Michael's hand and pointed to the narrowest path, barely visible between two massive pine trees. They ran through the gauntlet of duplicates, ignoring the hands that reached for them, the voices that called their names with increasing desperation and anger. The narrow path was treacherous, barely wide enough for one person, but it seemed to be leading upward, away from the heart of the forest. Behind them, the duplicates gave chase, their friendly masks finally slipping away to reveal something hungry and inhuman underneath. They moved through the trees like smoke, their forms shifting and blurring as they ran. "They're gaining on us," Michael panted. Derek looked back to see a sea of their own faces streaming through the forest, eyes glowing with unnatural light, mouths open in silent screams. They moved like a pack, coordinated and predatory. The path ahead split again, but this time there was something different about one of the branches. It was brighter, less oppressive, and Derek could swear he smelled something other than pine and decay. The scent of a parking lot, of civilization. They took the bright path without hesitation, crashing through undergrowth that seemed to tear at them with deliberate malice. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter behind them, as if the duplicates couldn't follow them onto this particular trail. After what felt like hours, but could have been minutes, they burst out of the tree line and onto a paved parking lot. Derek's truck sat exactly where they had left it 4 days earlier, rain beating on its red paint like tears of relief. They threw their gear into the back and climbed into the cab, locking the doors with shaking fingers. Derek started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot without looking back, but Michael couldn't resist checking the rearview mirror. The forest behind them looked normal, just trees and shadows in the gray morning light. but for just a moment, he thought he saw figures standing at the tree line, watching them leave. They drove in silence for 20 miles before either of them spoke. Finally, as they passed a sign for the next town, Michael cleared his throat. "We should report this. Tell someone about what happened up there." Derek nodded, but part of him wondered who would believe them. Who would believe that the forest could steal voices and create perfect copies of people? Who would believe that somewhere in those rain-soaked woods, dozens of duplicates were still calling out for help in voices that belonged to the living? As they drove toward safety, neither of them noticed the subtle changes in their own voices, the slight echo that accompanied their words, the way their shadows seemed to move independently of their bodies. The forest had let them go, but had kept pieces of them behind, and in return, it had given them pieces of itself to carry into the world beyond the trees. In the rearview mirror, Derek thought he saw his own face smiling back at him from the back seat, but when he turned to look, there was nothing there but empty space and the lingering scent of pine. The rain followed them all the way home, tapping against the windshield like fingers trying to find a way in, and sometimes, late at night, they could still hear their own voices calling from somewhere far away, pleading for rescue from echoes that would never stop. The forest was patient. It had learned to wait, and now it had new voices to add to its collection, voices that carried the promise of a world beyond the trees, where perfect duplicates could walk among the living and no one would ever know the difference, until they started screaming too. The windshield wipers of Marcus's Honda struggled against the torrential rain as he squinted through the darkness at the interstate signs. His wife Jennifer sat in the passenger seat, her knuckles white as she gripped the door handle with each flash of lightning that illuminated the desolate Nebraska highway. "We should have stopped in Omaha," Jennifer muttered, her voice barely audible over the thunderstorm. "This storm is getting worse." Marcus nodded, his eyes burning from hours of driving. They had been on the road for 12 hours straight, making their way from Denver to Chicago for his sister's wedding. What should have been a straightforward drive had turned into a nightmare when the storm system moved in faster than the weather reports had predicted. Another flash of lightning revealed a green highway sign ahead. "Exit 77 Millbrook, 2 miles. "I've never heard of Millbrook," Jennifer said, checking her phone. "And I have no signal out here." "At this point, I don't care if it's a ghost town," Marcus replied, his hands cramping from gripping the steering wheel. "We need to get off this road before we end up in a ditch." The exit ramp curved into darkness, leading them down a narrow two-lane road flanked by towering cornfields that swayed ominously in the wind. The headlights cut through sheets of rain as they drove deeper into what seemed like the middle of nowhere. "There," Jennifer pointed ahead. "I see lights." Through the storm, a neon sign flickered against the black sky. "Sunset Motel vacancy." The pink and blue neon cast an eerie glow across the wet pavement, and beneath it, smaller letters spelled out, "Established 1962." Marcus pulled into the parking lot, noting that theirs was the only car. The motel was a classic L-shaped building with maybe 20 rooms, each door painted a faded turquoise that had seen better decades. A small office sat at the corner, its windows glowing yellow against the storm. "It looks like something from the 1960s, Jennifer observed as they hurried through the rain toward the office door. A brass bell chimed as they entered, and they were greeted by the smell of old cigarettes and pine air freshener. Behind the counter stood an elderly man with silver hair slicked back and wearing a burgundy vest over a white shirt. His smile seemed too wide, too eager. "Welcome to the Sunset Motel," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Marcus couldn't place. "I'm Harold, the night manager. Terrible storm out there, isn't it?" "Yes, we need a room for the night," Marcus said, pulling out his wallet. "Just passing through." Harold's fingers drummed against the counter as he reached for a registration card. Of course. Room 19 is available. It's our nicest room, at the end of the building. Very quiet." As Marcus filled out the card, he noticed the other registration card in the box were yellowed with age. The one on top was dated 1987. "You don't get many guests, do you?" Jennifer asked, trying to make conversation. Harold's smile never wavered. "Oh, we get visitors from time to time. People who need shelter from storms, just like yourselves. The Sunset has been taking care of travelers for over 60 years." He handed Marcus an old-fashioned metal key with a plastic tag. "Room 19. Just head down to the end. You can park right in front of your door." Back outside, Marcus noticed that the storm seemed to have intensified. The wind howled through the motel's covered walkway, making the hanging light fixtures sway and cast dancing shadows on the walls. Room 19 was at the far end of the L-shaped building, isolated from the other rooms. Marcus fumbled with the key as Jennifer shivered beside him, her clothes soaked from their brief sprint from the car. The door opened with a heavy creak, revealing a room that looked like it had been frozen in time. The carpet was orange shag. The wallpaper featured a geometric pattern in browns and golds, and the furniture was all dark wood with brass handles. 2 double beds with orange bedspreads dominated the space. "Well, it's dry," Marcus said, flicking on the lights. The room was illuminated by a fixture with frosted glass shades that cast a warm, amber glow. Jennifer explored the small bathroom, while Marcus checked the heating unit. "The shower works, but there's no hot water yet," she called out. "Maybe it needs time to warm up." They settled in for the night, grateful to be out of the storm. Marcus turned on the old television, which only picked up static on most channels. Finally, he found a late-night movie channel playing a black-and-white film from 1950s. "I'm going to try to get some sleep," Jennifer said, pulling back the covers on one of the beds. "We should get an early start tomorrow if the storm clears." Marcus nodded, but something about the place made him restless. As Jennifer drifted off to sleep, he found himself standing by the window, peering out through the heavy curtains at the empty parking lot. The neon sign continued to flicker, and in its intermittent light, he could swear he saw other cars in the lot that hadn't been there before. He rubbed his eyes and looked again. The lot was empty except for their Honda. Around 2 a.m., Marcus was awakened by voices in the hallway. Muffled conversation and footsteps passed by their door, followed by the sound of other doors opening and closing. He sat up, listening carefully. More voices, different ones this time. A woman laughing, a man coughing, the sound of luggage being dragged across the concrete walkway. "Jennifer," he whispered, but his wife was deep in sleep, exhausted from the long day of driving. Marcus crept to the window and carefully pulled back the curtain. The parking lot was full of cars. Classic cars from different eras. A 1970s Buick, a 1980s Ford, even what looked like a 1960s Volkswagen van. All of them looked pristine, despite the storm. His heart began to race. Where had all these people come from? And why hadn't he heard them arrive? He decided to investigate, quietly slipping on his shoes and grabbing the room key. The door opened silently, and he stepped into the covered walkway. The storm had stopped completely. No rain, no wind, no thunder. The silence was absolute and unnerving. The air felt thick and humid, carrying scents of old perfume and cigarette smoke. Light spilled from under several doors, and he could hear muted conversations from within the rooms. Televisions playing old shows, people talking and laughing as if they were having the time of their lives. But something was wrong. The conversations sounded distant, hollow, like they were coming from far away or through water. Marcus walked toward the office, his footsteps echoing strangely in the stillness. Through the office window, he could see Harold still behind the counter, but the man wasn't alone. Several people stood around the office, men in suits and hats, women in dresses that looked decades out of date. They were all looking directly at him. Marcus froze, his breath catching in his throat. The people in the office weren't quite right. Their faces seemed blurred, indistinct, as if he were looking at them through frosted glass. And their eyes were too dark, too hollow. Harold raised his hand and waved, that same too wide smile on his face. The other figures turned to look at Marcus, their movements synchronized and unnatural. Marcus backed away slowly, his heart pounding. He needed to get Jennifer and leave. Now, as he turned to hurry back to room 19, he noticed that all the other room doors were now open, rectangles of yellow light spilling into the walkway. But the rooms beyond the doorways were empty. No furniture, no carpets, just bare walls and floors. Except the rooms weren't really empty. In each doorway stood a figure, barely visible in the shadows. Watching him, Marcus ran. He burst through the door of room 19 to find Jennifer sitting up in bed, wide awake and staring at him with an expression of terror. "Marcus," she whispered, "look at the bathroom." He turned toward the small bathroom. The mirror above the sink was fogged with condensation, and written in the moisture were words, "You can't leave." "We have to go," Marcus said, grabbing their belongings and throwing them into their bag. Right now, they rushed outside to their car, but Marcus's hand shook so badly he couldn't get the key into the ignition. Behind them, he could see figures emerging from the other rooms, walking slowly toward their car. The engine finally turned over, and Marcus threw the car into reverse. As they backed out of the parking space, Jennifer screamed. In the rearview mirror, the Sunset Motel was gone. In its place stood a burned-out shell of a building, charred walls reaching toward the sky like blackened bones. A sign hung crookedly from a broken post. Sunset Motel, fire claimed 23 lives, 1973 condemned. Marcus floored the accelerator, and they raced back toward the highway. In the distance, storm clouds were gathering again, and rain began to spatter the windshield. They drove in silence for 20 minutes before Jennifer finally spoke. "The radio," she said quietly. "Turn on the radio." Marcus fumbled for the radio dial and found a news station. The announcer's voice filled the car. "The 40th anniversary of the Sunset Motel fire that killed 23 people in Millbrook, Nebraska. The fire, which occurred on this date in 1973, was caused by faulty electrical wiring during a severe thunderstorm. Among the victims was night manager Harold Peterson, who died trying to help guests escape." Jennifer turned off the radio. They drove the rest of the way to Chicago without stopping, arriving at dawn exhausted and shaken. It wasn't until they were checking into a hotel in Chicago that Marcus pulled the registration card from his pocket, the one Harold had given him at the Sunset Motel. In the morning light, he could see that it was yellowed and brittle with age. The date at the top of the card read, July 15th, 1973, and at the bottom, in Harold's distinctive handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for staying at the Sunset Motel. We hope you'll visit us again soon." Marcus crumpled the card and threw it away. But that night, as he lay in their hotel room in downtown Chicago, he could swear he heard the sound of that brass bell chiming in the distance. Some places, he realized, don't want to let their guests go. And somewhere on a dark highway in Nebraska, exit 77 still appears to travelers caught in storms, leading them down a narrow road to a motel that shouldn't exist anymore. Harold is still there, behind the counter, wearing his burgundy vest and too wide smile. Room 19 is always available. And checkout time is never. The neon sign flickers against the storm. Sunset Motel vacancy. Always vacancy. Always waiting for the next travelers who need shelter from the storm. The rain hammered against the windows of Melissa's third-floor apartment in downtown Vancouver like bullets against glass. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and glanced at the clock on her kitchen wall. 11:47 p.m. The storm had been raging for hours, and the old building creaked and groaned with each gust of wind. Melissa had moved into the Granville Towers 6 months ago, drawn by the affordable rent and the vintage charm of the 1920s brick building. The landlord, M.R. Davidson, had been honest about the building's quirks, the radiators that clanged all night, the elevator that sometimes skipped the second floor, and the thin walls that let you hear your neighbor's every movement. But he had never mentioned the crying. It started 3 weeks ago. A soft whimpering that seemed to drift up through the heating vents in her bedroom floor. At first, Melissa assumed it was coming from the apartment below her. A young couple with a newborn, perhaps. She had knocked on their door one morning to politely mention the noise. But Janet and Michael, a couple in 2B, looked at her with confusion. "We don't have any children," Janet had said, her face creased with concern. Are you feeling all right, dear? Melissa had apologized and retreated to her apartment, embarrassed. But the crying continued, night after night, growing louder and more desperate. It was the sound of a child in distress, a toddler maybe, sobbing with the kind of heartbreak that only comes from being utterly alone. Tonight, as the storm raged outside, the crying was worse than ever. Melissa pressed her ear to the bedroom floor, trying to determine exactly where the sound was coming from. The wooden floorboards were cold against her cheek, and she could feel the vibrations of the old building settling. But beneath it all, unmistakably, was the sound of a child weeping. She grabbed a flashlight from her kitchen drawer and made her way down to the lobby. The building directory showed only 3 floors, ground level with the lobby and mailboxes, second floor with 4 apartments, and third floor with 4 more. No basement was listed, no storage area, no sublevel of any kind. M.R. Davidson lived in apartment 1A, just off the lobby. Melissa hesitated outside his door, knowing how crazy she would sound. But the crying was real. She was certain of it. Her knock echoed through the empty lobby. After several minutes, she heard shuffling footsteps and the click of multiple locks being undone. M.R. Davidson appeared in the doorway, his gray hair disheveled and his eyes heavy with sleep. "Melissa, what are you doing down here so late?" "I'm sorry to bother you, M.R. Davidson, but I need to ask you something important. Is there a basement in this building? Any kind of sublevel or storage area?" The old man's face went pale, and his grip tightened on the doorframe. "Why would you ask such a thing?" "I keep hearing crying, a child crying. It's coming from below my apartment, through the vents. But the couple in 2B doesn't have any children, and there's no basement." M.R. Davidson cut her off, his voice sharp. "This building was constructed on solid bedrock. No basement, no sublevel. You must be hearing the pipes. Old buildings make all kinds of noises." But Melissa could see something in his eyes, a flicker of fear, maybe even guilt. He was lying. "Please," she pressed, "if there's a child down there who needs help, go back to your apartment, Melissa. Get some sleep. If the noise continues, I'll have a maintenance man look at the heating system tomorrow." He closed the door before she could protest, and she heard the locks clicking back into place. Melissa stood in the dim lobby for several minutes, listening. The building was quiet except for the storm outside. No crying, no sounds at all. But as soon as she climbed back to the 3rd floor, the weeping began again, louder and more frantic than before. She spent the next hour researching the building online. Granville Towers had been built in 1923 by a wealthy businessman named Henry Blackwood. For 30 years, it had been luxury apartments for Vancouver's elite. But in 1953, something had happened. The newspaper archives were sparse, but Melissa found a brief mention in the Vancouver Sun dated October 15th, 1953. Police continue investigation into disappearance of 5-year-old Tommy Blackwood, son of building owner Henry Blackwood. The child vanished from the family's penthouse apartment 3 days ago. No signs of forced entry or struggle were found. Henry Blackwood has offered a substantial reward for information leading to his son's safe return. There were no follow-up articles, no resolution. Tommy Blackwood had simply vanished, and apparently, the story had been buried along with him. Melissa's blood ran cold as she read the child's name. Tommy, the crying she heard. Could it somehow be connected to this missing boy from 70 years ago? She tried to dismiss the thought as ridiculous, but the timing was too coincidental. The building's dark history, the landlord's obvious discomfort with her questions about a basement, and now this tragic story of a lost child. She closed her laptop and returned to her bedroom. The crying had stopped again, but she knew it would resume. It always did, usually around 2 a.m., when the building was at its quietest. Melissa lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and waiting. The storm was beginning to weaken, but the wind still howled through the gaps in her windows. At 1:58 a.m., the crying began. This time, she was ready. Melissa had moved her furniture away from the heating vent in the corner of her bedroom. She knelt beside it and began unscrewing the metal grate with a kitchen knife. The screws were old and rusted, but they eventually gave way. The vent opening was larger than she expected, about 2 feet square. She shined her flashlight into the darkness and saw a narrow shaft that dropped straight down. The crying was definitely coming from below, echoing up through the metal ductwork. Without hesitation, Melissa lowered herself into the shaft. It was a tight fit, but she managed to squeeze through. The shaft descended about 8 feet before opening into a larger space. She dropped down, landing on a concrete floor. Her flashlight beam swept across what was unmistakably a basement room. The walls were rough stone, and the ceiling was low, maybe 6 feet high. The air was damp and carried the musty smell of decades of neglect. But M.R. Davidson had insisted there was no basement. The crying was much louder now, coming from somewhere deeper in the darkness. Melissa followed the sound, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. She passed several empty rooms, their doorways dark and forbidding. Old furniture was scattered throughout. A broken rocking chair, a child's wooden toy chest, a crib with rotting mattress. The crying led her to the far end of the basement, where a heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar. Beyond it, she could see flickering light, not electric, but the warm, dancing glow of candlelight. Melissa pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small, maybe 10 feet square, with walls covered in children's drawings. Crayon pictures of houses and trees, and stick figures holding hands. In the center of the room sat a small boy, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, hunched over a pile of toys. He was translucent, like looking at someone through frosted glass, but she could make out his dark hair and the suspenders he wore over his white shirt. The boy looked up at her with hollow, dark eyes. "Are you my mama?" he asked in a voice that seemed to come from far away. "I've been waiting so long for someone to come." Melissa's heart hammered in her chest, but she forced herself to speak. "Are you Tommy? Tommy Blackwood?" The boy nodded, tears streaming down his pale cheeks. "Papa put me down here when I was bad. He said I had to stay until I learned to be good. But I've been good for so long. I promise I've been good. Tommy, your papa isn't here anymore. That was a very long time ago. He comes to visit sometimes," Tommy said, his voice becoming smaller. "He brings me food and tells me stories. But he hasn't come in so long. I'm so hungry and I'm scared of the dark." Melissa realized with growing horror that Henry Blackwood hadn't lost his son to a kidnapper or accident. He had locked the boy in this hidden basement room as punishment and then, for reasons she couldn't fathom, had simply left him there to die. The official story about a disappearance had been a cover-up. But how was Tommy still here? How was she seeing him, talking to him? "Tommy, I want to help you, but you're not supposed to be here anymore. You need to go somewhere else, somewhere better." The boy's face crumpled with fear. "I can't leave. Papa said I have to stay here until he comes back. If I leave, he'll be so angry." "Your papa's gone, Tommy. He died a long time ago. He can't hurt you anymore." Tommy began crying harder, and Melissa could feel the temperature in the room dropping. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and frost began forming on the stone walls. "He's not gone," Tommy whispered, and his voice carried an edge of terror that made Melissa's skin crawl. "He's here. He's always here." The candles in the room suddenly went out, plunging them into complete darkness. Melissa fumbled for her flashlight, but before she could turn it on, she heard heavy footsteps echoing through the basement. "Tommy." A man's voice boomed through the darkness, cold and filled with rage. "Tommy, what have you done? I told you never to let anyone find you." Melissa clicked on her flashlight, and the beam illuminated a tall figure standing in the doorway. Henry Blackwood looked exactly as he had in the old newspaper photos, except for his eyes. They were black voids, empty of any humanity. "You shouldn't have come down here," Henry said, his gaze fixed on Melissa. "Now you'll have to stay. Tommy needs a playmate, and I need someone to watch over him when I'm away." Melissa backed against the far wall, her mind racing. The ghost of Henry Blackwood stepped into the room, and she could feel malevolent energy radiating from him like heat from a furnace. "Please," she whispered. "I won't tell anyone. I'll just leave and forget this ever happened." Henry laughed. A sound like breaking glass. Oh, but you can't leave. Not now that you know our secret. Tommy has been so lonely down here. Haven't you, son? The boy cowered in the corner, still crying. I'm sorry, Papa. I didn't mean to call out. I was just so scared and lonely. It's all right, Tommy. Everything will be fine now. Melissa is going to stay with us forever. Melissa felt invisible hands grabbing at her, trying to pull her deeper into the room. The temperature plummeted even further, and ice began forming on her clothes and hair. She struggled against the supernatural force, but it was like fighting against concrete. Then, through her panic, she remembered something her grandmother had told her about dealing with spirits. Sometimes, the dead were trapped by their own guilt and pain, unable to move on until they found peace or resolution. "Henry," she called out, her voice shaking but determined. "Tommy doesn't belong here. He was just a little boy. What you did to him was wrong." The ghostly man's face twisted with rage. He was disobedient. He needed to learn discipline. He needed love. Melissa shouted back, "He was your son, and you let him die alone in the dark." Henry's form began to flicker and waver. "I was going to come back for him. I was going to let him out when he learned his lesson." "But you didn't, did you? You got scared when people started asking questions. You let everyone think he was kidnapped, rather than admit what you had done. You left him here to starve." "Stop," Henry whispered, his voice breaking. Melissa turned to Tommy, who was watching the exchange with wide, frightened eyes. "Tommy, you don't have to stay here anymore. Your papa was wrong to put you here, and you've waited long enough. It's time to go home." "But where is home?" Tommy asked, his voice small and lost. "Somewhere warm and bright, where people will love you the way you should have been loved. Somewhere you'll never be alone or afraid again." Tommy looked at his father's wavering form, then back at Melissa. "Will you come with me?" "I can't, sweetheart. That place is just for you. But I promise you'll be happy there." Tommy stood up slowly, wiping tears from his translucent cheeks. As he did, the room began to fill with a soft, golden light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Tommy, no." Henry lunged forward, but his form was becoming more insubstantial by the moment. "You have to stay. You have to obey me." Tommy looked at his father with an expression of profound sadness. "I forgive you, Papa, but I can't stay here anymore. It's time for both of us to go." The golden light grew brighter, and Melissa could see figures waiting in the glow, warm, welcoming presences that radiated love and peace. Tommy walked toward them without looking back. Henry's scream of rage and despair echoed through the basement as his form dissolved completely. The oppressive cold lifted, and the malevolent presence that had filled the room dissipated like smoke. Melissa found herself alone in the small basement room. The children's drawings were still on the walls, but they looked faded and old now, like historical artifacts rather than recent artwork. The toys Tommy had been playing with crumbled to dust as she watched. She made her way back through the basement to the heating shaft and climbed up to her apartment. As she replaced the vent cover, she wondered if anyone would believe what had happened. Probably not, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that Tommy Blackwood was finally free. Melissa never heard the crying again. The basement rooms, when she checked the next day, were gone, filled in with concrete as if they had never existed. Mr. Davidson claimed no knowledge of any construction work, but she noticed he seemed lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The building felt different after that night. Warmer, more welcoming. The other tenants commented on it too, how the old place seemed less creaky, less oppressive. Even the elevators started working properly. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Melissa thought she could hear something through the vents. Not crying, but laughter, the sound of a little boy at play, happy and free at last. 3 months later, she received a package with no return address. Inside was an old photograph of a dark-haired boy in suspenders, smiling broadly as he played with a wooden toy train. On the back, in a child's careful handwriting, were 2 words: "Thank you." Melissa kept the photograph on her mantle, a reminder that sometimes the dead don't rest in peace because the living won't let them go. But love, she had learned, was stronger than guilt, and forgiveness could free even the most tormented spirit. The Granville Towers stood quiet in the Vancouver rain, its secrets finally at rest. The first time Elena heard the knocking, she thought it was just the wind rattling the old shutters of their Victorville home. The autumn storm had been raging for hours, sending sheets of rain against the windows and making the century-old house creak like a ship in rough seas. Her husband Marcus was working late again at the accounting firm, and their twin daughters, Lily and Rose, were fast asleep upstairs. Knock, knock, knock. 3 deliberate raps on the front door, slow and measured. Elena paused the television and listened. The sound came again, cutting through the howling wind with unnatural clarity. She approached the door cautiously, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. The porch light had burned out weeks ago, and Marcus kept forgetting to replace it. Through the frosted glass panels, she could see only darkness. "Hello," she called out, her voice barely audible over the storm. No response, just the relentless drumming of rain on the roof. Elena pressed her eye to the peephole, but the view was obscured by condensation and darkness. She considered opening the door, but something deep in her gut warned against it. Instead, she retreated to the kitchen and called Marcus. "There's someone at the door," she whispered into the phone, though she couldn't explain why she was whispering. Probably just a neighbor needing help with the storm damage. Marcus replied, his voice distant and distracted. "I'll be home in an hour. Just don't answer it if you're not comfortable." But by the time Marcus arrived home, drenched and exhausted, the knocking had stopped. Elena told him about the visitor, and he checked the porch, finding nothing but scattered leaves and a puddle where someone might have stood. Maybe it was a tree branch, he suggested, though they both knew the nearest tree was 20 feet away. The second incident happened 3 nights later during another storm. Elena had started to dread the weather reports, that familiar tightness in her chest whenever dark clouds gathered on the horizon. This time, she was ready. Knock, knock, knock. The same rhythm, the same deliberate pace. Elena crept to the living room window and peered through the curtains. The street lamp cast a weak circle of light on the wet pavement, but the porch remained shrouded in shadow. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her fingers trembling. "There's someone on my property," she told the dispatcher. "They won't identify themselves, and I'm alone with my children." The police arrived within 10 minutes, their red and blue lights painting the quiet suburban street in alternating colors. Officer Jenkins was a kind man in his 50s who'd been patrolling Victorville for over 2 decades. He walked the perimeter of the house with his flashlight, checked the porch, the yard, even looked under the deck. "No signs of anyone, ma'am," he reported, removing his rain-soaked cap. "But I did notice something odd. There are no footprints leading up to your porch, even though the ground is muddy enough that there should be." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the open door. "What does that mean?" Officer Jenkins shrugged, but his expression was troubled. Could mean whoever was here was very careful about where they stepped. Or he trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with whatever he was thinking. Or what? Well, there's been some talk around town. Other families reporting similar incidents. Always during storms. Always the knocking. Never any footprints. Some folks think it might be kids playing pranks, but he left the sentence hanging, tipped his cap, and disappeared into the night. Elena barely slept that night, and the next few storm-free days passed in an anxious haze. She found herself checking weather reports obsessively, pleading with whatever cosmic force controlled the skies to keep the storms away. But Canada's autumn weather was unpredictable, and by Friday evening, another system was rolling in. Marcus had begun working even later, almost as if he were avoiding home during the storms. When Elena confronted him about it, he claimed it was just coincidence, but she could see the fear in his eyes that mirrored her own. That night, she was ready. She'd borrowed a high-powered flashlight from their neighbor Bert and positioned herself by the front window with a clear view of the porch. The twins were spending the night at Elena's sister's house in Ottawa, giving her one less thing to worry about. The storm arrived with unusual violence, rattling the windows and sending the old oak tree in the backyard swaying dangerously. Elena sat in the dark living room, flashlight in hand, waiting. It came at exactly 11:47 p.m. Knock, knock, knock. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she switched on the flashlight and aimed it at the porch. What she saw made her blood freeze in her veins. There was indeed someone standing there, but the figure was all wrong. It stood perfectly still in the driving rain, seemingly unaffected by the storm that was soaking everything else. The rain fell around it, but not on it, as if the figure existed in a pocket of dry air. It was tall, unnaturally thin, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned dark coat that hung too loosely on its frame. But it was the face that made Elena drop the flashlight with a crash. There was no face. Where features should have been was just smooth, pale skin, like an unfinished mannequin. The thing stood motionless for several seconds under a beam of light, then slowly turned what should have been its head toward the window where she crouched. Elena scrambled backward, her breath coming in short gasps. When she found the courage to look again, the porch was empty. She called Marcus immediately, her words tumbling out in a panicked rush. For the first time, he didn't try to rationalize or explain away what she'd seen. "I'm coming home right now," he said, and she could hear him already grabbing his keys. But when Marcus arrived 20 minutes later, he wasn't alone. Elena watched from the window as he climbed out of his car with two other people, a woman in a long coat and a man carrying what looked like recording equipment. "These are researchers from McGill University," Marcus explained as he led them into the house. "They've been investigating similar reports across eastern Canada." The woman introduced herself as Dr. Winters, a professor of paranormal psychology. She had kind eyes, but an intensity that made Elena uncomfortable. "What you're experiencing isn't unique," Dr. Winters explained as she set up a recorder on the coffee table. "We've documented 17 similar cases across Quebec and Ontario over the past 3 years. Always the same pattern. The knocking during storms, the faceless figure, the absence of physical traces." "What is it?" Elena asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Dr. Winters exchanged a glance with her partner, Dr. Reeves. "We're still trying to understand that, but we believe it's something that feeds on fear, on the anxiety of waiting for something terrible to happen. The storm seemed to give it strength, and it appears to target families with young children." "Why?" Marcus asked. "Fear is stronger when you have something to protect," Dr. Reeves replied grimly, "and parental fear is the most potent kind." They set up equipment throughout the house, cameras, motion sensors, electromagnetic field detectors. Dr. Winters explained they wanted to document whatever appeared during the next storm, which according to weather reports would be in 2 days. Those 2 days crawled by with agonizing slowness. Elena couldn't concentrate on anything, jumping at every sound, checking and rechecking the locks on all the doors and windows. The twins remained at her sister's house, and Elena found herself grateful for their absence, even as she missed them terribly. The storm arrived Tuesday night with unprecedented fury. The power went out twice, and Elena wondered if their electronic equipment would even function properly. Dr. Winters and Dr. Reeves took positions at different windows, while Marcus and Elena huddled together on the couch, watching the readouts on various monitoring devices. At 11:47 p.m. exactly, every electromagnetic detector in the house began screaming. The knocking came immediately after, but this time it was different. Instead of 3 measured raps, it was continuous, growing more insistent and urgent. The sound seemed to come from multiple points around the house. The front door, the back door, the windows, even from inside the walls themselves. Dr. Winters' voice cut through the chaos. "It's on the porch, but I can see it simultaneously at the back door. That should be impossible." Elena grabbed Marcus's hand as the knocking intensified. The sound was no longer just knocking. There was a scraping quality to it now, like fingernails dragging across wood. The temperature just dropped 15 degrees. Dr. Reeves reported from his position by the kitchen window, and the electromagnetic readings are off the charts. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The knocking, the scraping, Even the storm itself seemed to pause. In the suffocating silence, they heard something new, a sound that made Elena's skin crawl. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the house. But these weren't normal footsteps. They had a wet, sliding quality, like something being dragged across the ground. "Everyone stay exactly where you are," Dr. Winters whispered, her voice tight with concentration. She was staring at a handheld device that was blinking rapidly. The entity is moving around the perimeter. It's looking for a way in. The footsteps stopped directly outside the living room window. Elena could feel eyes on her, though she couldn't see anything through the rain-streaked glass. The feeling was so intense, so violating, that she had to fight the urge to run upstairs and hide. Then came the voice. It wasn't heard so much as felt, a vibration that seemed to resonate in their bones rather than their ears. The words were indistinct, but the meaning was clear. It wanted inside. It had been waiting so patiently, knocking so politely, and now it was tired of being ignored. Dr. Reeves started reading something in Latin from a small book, his voice barely steady. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and frost began forming on the inside of the windows, despite the late autumn warmth outside. The voice came again, closer now, as if whatever was speaking had pressed its mouth against the glass. This time Elena could make out words, though she wished she couldn't. "Let me in. I've been so patient. Let me in. The children are safe for now. Let me in." Marcus stood up abruptly, his face pale but determined. "What does it want? What happens if we let it in?" Dr. Winters grabbed his arm. "You absolutely cannot open any door or window. The moment you invite it inside, it becomes something else entirely, something much worse. But it knows about Lily and Rose," Elena whispered. "It knows they're not here." The voice came again, and this time there was amusement in it. "Lily likes to sleep with her teddy bear. Rose had a nightmare about spiders last week. They'll be home soon." Elena's blood turned to ice water. Those details were too specific, too intimate. This thing had been watching them for far longer than they'd realized. Dr. Winters was frantically checking her equipment. The electromagnetic signature is changing. It's getting stronger, more focused. "I think it's about to try something different." The lights went out completely, plunging them into absolute darkness. The backup generator should have kicked in, but there was only silence. Then, from somewhere upstairs, came the sound of a door creaking open. "That's impossible," Marcus breathed. "We're all down here." But they could all hear it, slow, wet footsteps moving across the floor above them. The ceiling creaked under the weight of something that shouldn't exist, something that had found a way inside despite all their precautions. Dr. Reeves was speaking urgently into his radio, calling for backup, but all he got was static. They were completely cut off. The footsteps moved to the top of the stairs and stopped. In the darkness, they could hear breathing, not the normal rhythm of human respiration, but something labored and unnatural, like air being forced through damaged lungs. Elena gripped Marcus's hand so tightly she could feel his bones grinding together. The researcher's equipment was going haywire, lights blinking and alarms sounding in a cacophony of electronic panic. Then came the worst sound of all, the slow creak of the first stair step as something began to descend toward them. Dr. Winters made a decision. She pulled out a flare and struck it, filling the room with harsh red light. What they saw made Elena scream. The thing on the stairs wasn't entirely solid. It flickered in and out of existence like a bad television signal, but what they could see was nightmare fuel. It had grown since its time on the porch, stretching and distorting until it was nearly 8 feet tall. The dark coat had merged with its body, becoming part of its skin, and where its face should have been was now something worse than emptiness. There were suggestions of features, like someone had tried to sculpt a human face from shadow and failed miserably. "Everyone out the back door now," Dr. Winters screamed, but even as they turned to run, they could see another figure standing in the kitchen doorway, blocking their escape. They were trapped. The thing on the stairs continued its descent, each step making the house shudder. The air grew colder with its approach, and Elena's breath came out in visible puffs. Dr. Reeves was still chanting in Latin, but his voice was growing weaker, as if the entity was draining his strength. Marcus pulled Elena behind the couch as the creature reached the bottom of the stairs. It stood there for a moment, that horrible knot face turning slowly to survey the room. When its attention fixed on their hiding spot, Elena felt a pressure in her mind, like cold fingers probing at her thoughts. Images flashed through her consciousness, her daughters playing in their room, sleeping peacefully, walking to school. But in each image, there was a shadow following them, always just out of sight, but always present. The message was clear. It could reach Lily and Rose whenever it wanted. Dr. Winters must have realized what was happening, because she suddenly lunged forward with something in her hand, a small silver cross that gleamed in the flare light. "You cannot have them," she shouted, pressing the cross against the creature's chest. The thing let out a sound like steam escaping from a broken pipe and staggered backward. Where the cross had touched, its shadowy flesh was burning with cold white fire. But instead of retreating, the creature seemed to split apart, becoming multiple figures that surrounded them from all sides. Elena realized with growing horror that this had been its plan all along, to get them to invite it inside where it could multiply and become truly dangerous. Dr. Reeves collapsed, his book falling from nerveless fingers. The Latin had stopped, and with it, whatever protection his chanting had provided. The creatures began to close in, their wet footsteps squelching on the hardwood floor. Elena could smell them now, the odor of rain and decay, and something else, something that reminded her of the way the air smelled just before lightning struck. Marcus stood up slowly, his hands raised in what might have been surrender or supplication. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice surprisingly steady. "What will it take for you to leave us alone?" The creatures stopped moving. The one that had been on the stairs, apparently the original, tilted its head at an impossible angle. When it spoke, its voice came from everywhere at once, the walls, the ceiling, inside their own heads. "I want to come inside when it storms. I want to sit by your fire and watch your children sleep. I want to be part of your family." The simple, childlike request was somehow more terrifying than any threat would have been. Dr. Winters, still clutching her cross, shook her head frantically. "That's how it spreads. It attaches to families, feeds on their love and warmth until there's nothing left but empty shells. We've seen it before." "What happened to the other families?" Elena asked, though she was afraid to hear the answer. "They disappeared. All of them. Houses left empty. No signs of struggle. No bodies ever found. Just empty homes and neighbors who slowly forgot they had ever existed." The creatures began moving again, but this time they weren't approaching. They were backing away, retreating toward the walls and windows. "Think about it," the voice said as the figures faded. "Every storm, I'll be here. Every dark night. Every moment you're alone with your children. I can wait forever. Can you?" The flare sputtered and died, plunging them back into darkness. When Dr. Winters lit another one, the creatures were gone, but the house still felt wrong, contaminated somehow. The storm passed just before dawn, leaving behind a crisp, clean morning that seemed to mock the horror of the night before. Elena and Marcus sat on their front porch, the same porch where the creature had stood, watching the sunrise paint the sky in gentle pastels. Dr. Winters and Dr. Reeves had packed up their equipment and left with promises to stay in touch, but Elena could see in their eyes that they didn't expect to find a solution. This thing, whatever it was, had been playing its game for a very long time. "We could move," Marcus suggested quietly, but they both knew it wouldn't matter. The thing had attached itself to them, not to the house. It would follow them wherever they went. Elena thought about her daughters, still safe at her sister's house, still innocent of the horror that had entered their lives. How could she explain to them that they could never feel completely safe again? That every storm would bring the possibility of something standing on their porch, waiting patiently to be invited in? Her phone rang, startling her from her dark thoughts. It was her sister Carol calling from Ottawa. "The strangest thing happened last night," Carol said without preamble. "The girls kept saying they heard knocking at the door during the storm, but every time I checked, there was no one there. And this morning, Lily asked me why the sad man was standing in the rain. Elena's blood froze. She looked at Marcus, who had heard enough of the conversation to understand. It had found the children. The game was no longer about waiting patiently on their porch. The rules had changed, and Elena realized with sickening clarity that they had been changed the moment they had allowed it into their house, even if just for that brief encounter in their living room. As she hung up the phone, Elena noticed that the morning sky was already beginning to cloud over. The weather forecast had mentioned possible thunderstorms for that evening. She could feel it out there somewhere, waiting and watching, no longer confined to their porch or even their home. It had tasted their fear, learned their weaknesses, and now it would pursue them with the patience of something that existed outside of normal time. Elena stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the quiet suburban street that no longer felt like home. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, and she knew with absolute certainty that their nightmare was just beginning. The thing that waited on porches had found its way inside, and now it would never let them go. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Elena could swear she heard the sound of slow, deliberate knocking echoing from somewhere far away, or perhaps from everywhere at once. The first time it happened, Jessica Morrison thought it was just a coincidence. She was standing in her front yard in Millbrook, Ontario, watering her roses when the clouds above her house suddenly darkened. Within seconds, rain began to fall, but only over her property. The neighboring houses remained bone dry under clear blue skies. Jessica looked around in bewilderment. The rain fell in a perfect circle, maybe 30 feet in diameter, centered directly over her two-story colonial home. Beyond that invisible boundary, her neighbors continued their Saturday afternoon activities, mowing lawns, walking dogs, chatting over fences, completely oblivious to the downpour just yards away. She rushed inside, convinced it would pass quickly, but the rain continued for exactly 17 minutes. When it stopped, the sun returned as if nothing had happened, leaving only her yard and house soaked, while everything else remained untouched. Jessica mentioned it to her neighbor, M.R.S. Patterson, who lived next door. "Rain? What rain?" M.R.S. Patterson asked, squinting at Jessica as if she'd lost her mind. "It's been sunny all day." Jessica pointed to her wet lawn, the puddles in her driveway, the water still dripping from her gutters. But M.R.S. Patterson just shrugged and walked away, muttering something about the heat getting to people. 3 days later, it happened again. Jessica was at Millbrook Grocery when the familiar darkening began above her head. Other shoppers looked up nervously as storm clouds gathered in a tight formation directly over the store. Rain began falling on the parking lot, on the store's roof, drumming against the windows. But across the street, people walked casually in bright sunshine. The store manager, Derek Williams, came running from his office. "This is impossible," he whispered, staring out the window. The weather report said clear skies all week. Jessica felt a chill that had nothing to do with the sudden temperature drop. She grabbed her groceries and hurried to her car, rain soaking through her jacket. As she drove away, she watched in her rearview mirror as the clouds began to follow her. That's when she knew something was terribly wrong. The rain cloud moved with unnatural precision, maintaining its position directly above her Honda Civic as she drove through Millbrook's residential streets. Other drivers seemed oblivious to the bizarre sight, a single storm cloud drifting low across a clear sky, trailing her like a lost pet. Jessica pulled into her driveway and ran inside, her heart pounding. Through her living room window, she watched the clouds settle over her house once again. The rain fell steadily, creating rivulets that ran down her windows like tears. She called the National Weather Service, but they had no record of any precipitation in the area. She called her sister Marie in Toronto, describing what was happening. "You need to see a doctor," Marie said gently. "Maybe you're having some kind of breakdown." But Jessica knew she wasn't crazy. She took photos, recorded videos on her phone. Yet somehow, every image showed only clear skies and sunshine. The camera couldn't capture what her eyes clearly saw. The pattern continued for 2 weeks. Every few days, the rain would find her. At the library, at the gas station, at her job at Millbrook Insurance. Always the same. A localized downpour that followed her movements while the rest of the world basked in perfect weather. People began to avoid her. Her co-workers whispered when she walked by, their voices carrying fragments of concern and suspicion. Jessica noticed how conversations stopped when she entered a room, how eyes tracked her movements with growing unease. It's like she brings bad weather with her. She overheard Sarah Collins from accounting tell someone in the break room. Jessica tried staying indoors, hoping to break whatever curse had attached itself to her. But the rain found ways to reach her even inside. It fell through closed windows without breaking the glass, pooled on her kitchen floor despite no visible leaks, dripped from her bedroom, ceiling though the roof showed no damage. Sleep became impossible. The sound of rain on her roof grew louder each night, drumming with increasing intensity until it sounded like someone, or something, was trying to beat its way inside. On the 15th night, Jessica woke to find her bedroom filled with an impossible mist. The rain was falling inside her house, but upward instead of down. Droplets rose from the floor, defying gravity, forming spiraling patterns in the air around her bed. In the swirling water, shapes began to form. Faces, dozens of them, their features shifting and flowing like liquid mercury. Some were recent neighbors she recognized from Millbrook. Others seemed older, their faces bearing the worn look of decades past. All of them stared at her with hollow, accusing eyes. Jessica scrambled backward against her headboard, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The faces moved closer, their mouths opening as if trying to speak. No sound came out, but she could feel their desperation, their hunger. One face pushed forward from the rest, a young man with kind eyes and a gentle smile that didn't match the terror radiating from his watery features. His mouth formed words she couldn't hear, but somehow she understood. "Help us." Jessica blinked, and the vision vanished. She found herself alone in her dark bedroom, completely dry, but on her nightstand sat a newspaper, yellowed with age, dated 47 years ago. The headline read, "Millbrook family disappears during freak storm." With trembling hands, she read the article. The Morrison family, her own last name, had vanished during an unprecedented weather event. A localized rainstorm had appeared over their property on ELM Street, the exact address where Jessica now lived. Witnesses reported seeing the family standing in their yard as the rain intensified, but when the storm cleared 17 minutes later, they were gone. The house had stood empty for decades before Jessica bought it 3 months ago. She stared at the newspaper, her mind reeling. Morrison, the same family name, but that had to be a coincidence. She had no relatives in Millbrook. She had chosen the house randomly, drawn by its Victorian charm and affordable price. The next morning, Jessica drove to the Millbrook Historical Society. The librarian, elderly woman named MRS. Chun, helped her access the archives. Together, they found more records, birth certificates, property deeds, family photos. The missing Morrison family consisted of parents Thomas and Helen, and their daughter Jessica, age 7. Jessica stared at the faded photograph. The little girl's face was her own, unmistakable despite the 47 years that should have passed. Same dark hair, same green eyes, same small scar above the left eyebrow from a childhood accident she clearly remembered. "This is impossible," Jessica whispered. MRS. Chin studied the documents with growing concern. "According to these records, you should be 54 years old, but you can't be more than 25. Jessica's hands shook as she reached for more files. She found school records, medical files, even a library card issued to Jessica Morrison in 1977, all bearing her name, all describing her life, but a life that had supposedly ended 47 years ago. That evening, the rain came again, but this time Jessica didn't run. She stood in her front yard, letting the water soak through her clothes, feeling its familiar weight. The droplets were warm against her skin, almost welcoming. As the rain intensified, the world around her began to change. The modern houses faded, replaced by older buildings. Cars disappeared from driveways, replaced by vehicles from decades past. Street lights transformed into old-fashioned lampposts. Millbrook was changing, reverting to how it had looked in 1977. Through the rain, Jessica saw them approaching. Her parents, Thomas and Helen, looking exactly as they had in the old photographs. They walked slowly across the wet grass, their faces filled with a mixture of joy and sorrow. "Jessica," her mother called, her voice echoing strangely through the downpour. "We've been waiting for you to come home. You've been lost for so long," her father added, reaching out his hand. "But the rain brought you back to us." Jessica felt tears mixing with the rainwater on her cheeks. Memories began flooding back, not memories of her life in modern Millbrook, but of her real childhood, playing in this same yard, helping her mother tend the garden, reading bedtime stories with her father. The rain had taken them that night in 1977, pulled them into some space between worlds where time moved differently. They had been waiting, trapped in a place where the past and present collided, held together only by the supernatural storm that had claimed them. Jessica had somehow escaped, thrown forward through time, given a chance at a normal life. But the rain had never stopped looking for her. It had searched for 47 years, following any trace of her existence, waiting for her to return to the place where she belonged. "I remember now," Jessica whispered. The false memories of growing up elsewhere, of choosing this house by chance, began to fade like mist. "I never left, did I? I've been here all along." Her parents smiled sadly and nodded. Around them, other figures emerged from the rain. All the people who had disappeared over the decades, pulled into the storm's endless cycle. The Millbrook that existed in daylight was just a shadow of the real town, the one that lived forever in the rain. Jessica felt herself becoming lighter, her solid form beginning to dissolve into droplets. The modern world was slipping away, revealing the truth that had always been hidden beneath. The next morning, Mrs. Patterson knocked on the door of the house on Yelm Street. She had been meaning to check on Jessica, who hadn't been seen for several days. But when she peered through the windows, the house appeared to be empty, abandoned. Later, when she asked around the neighborhood, no one could remember Jessica clearly. Their memories of her were vague, like trying to recall a dream. The Millbrook Insurance Office had no record of ever employing anyone by that name. The house on Yelm Street was put up for sale again, its previous occupant having simply vanished. The real estate listing mentioned nothing about the property's history, nothing about the families who had disappeared there over the decades. But sometimes, on clear sunny days, neighbors reported brief showers that seemed to fall from nowhere, always over that one house, always lasting exactly 17 minutes. And sometimes, if you looked closely through the rain, you could see figures moving in the windows, a family finally reunited, waiting for the next lost soul to find their way home. The rain that fell from nowhere was never really random. It was searching, calling, gathering its own. And in Millbrook, Ontario, it had found what it was looking for. In the town records, a new file appeared overnight. A missing person report for Jessica Morrison, dated 47 years ago. The case was immediately marked as closed, resolved. Another soul returned to where it belonged. Another family made whole in the space between raindrops. The storm clouds gathered again the next week, this time over a house 3 towns away. A young man named David Harrison was watering his lawn when the sky darkened above him. He looked up nervously as the first drops began to fall, wondering why the rain seemed to be following him. He had no idea he had been missing for 32 years. The storm hit Whitmore Creek, Montana, with unprecedented fury. Hurricane-force winds tore through the small mountain town, snapping century-old pines like matchsticks and plunging the entire valley into darkness. By morning, cell towers lay twisted and broken, their metal frames scattered across the mountainside like the bones of some massive beast. Rachel Winters pressed her phone against her ear, listening to nothing but static. 3 days without service. 3 days of isolation in a town where the nearest neighbor was miles away. She worked as the town's sole emergency dispatcher, but now she felt more helpless than ever. The landlines were down too. The radio at the station crackled with nothing but white noise. Whitmore Creek had become an island, cut off from the world by walls of fallen trees and washed-out roads. It was on the fourth day that Rachel's phone buzzed. She stared at the screen in disbelief. One bar of service flickered weakly in the corner. But that wasn't what made her blood run cold. It was the notification that appeared beneath it. You have 47 new voicemails. Rachel's thumb hovered over the phone app. 47 messages? Impossible. The cell towers were destroyed. She had seen the wreckage herself. But as she opened the voicemail inbox, her breath caught in her throat. The first message was time-stamped 3 days ago, right after the storm hit. The caller ID made her hands tremble. Grandma Rose, received 3 days ago. Grandma Rose had been dead for 15 years. With shaking fingers, Rachel pressed play. The voice that emerged from the speaker was unmistakably her grandmother's, though it carried a hollow, distant quality, as if speaking from the bottom of a well. Rachel, sweetheart, I know you can hear me. I've been trying to reach you. There's something you need to know about the storm. It wasn't just wind and rain, dear. It opened something. Something that should have stayed closed. The message cut off abruptly, leaving only silence. Rachel dropped the phone as if it had burned her. Her grandmother's voice, exactly as she remembered it. The same gentle cadence. The same pet name she had used since Rachel was 5 years old. But Grandma Rose had died in this very house, in the bedroom upstairs, her hand growing cold in Rachel's grip. The phone buzzed again. Another voicemail. Dad received 2 days ago. Rachel's father had died in a car accident when she was 16. The message was brief, his voice crackling with static. RACH, listen to me carefully. Don't go to the old cemetery on Miller Road. Whatever you do, stay away from there. The barrier is gone. They're all trying to come back. Rachel's vision blurred. She stumbled to the kitchen window and peered out at the storm-ravaged landscape. Miller Road was just 2 miles from her house. The cemetery there dated back to the 1800s, when Whitmore Creek was nothing more than a logging camp. Many of the graves were unmarked, their wooden markers long since rotted away. The phone continued to buzz throughout the day. Message after message from the dead. Her high school friend Jessica, who had died in a skiing accident, rolled. I can see you through your kitchen window. Can you let me in? Just for a little while. Her neighbor Amar Henley, who had passed away last winter. The storm woke us all up, Rachel. But some of us aren't ready to go back to sleep. Her childhood dog Buddy somehow. Woof, woof. Come outside and play, Rachel. I'm waiting by the old oak tree. The one where you buried me. Each message was more disturbing than the last. The voices were perfect replicas, down to every speech pattern and mannerism. But they all carried that same hollow, echoing quality. And with each new message, the static grew louder, more aggressive, until it sounded less like interference and more like whispered threats. By evening, Rachel couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed a flashlight and her father's old hunting rifle from the gun cabinet. If this was some sick joke, some elaborate hoax, she would put an end to it. She had to see Miller Road Cemetery for herself. The walk through the forest was treacherous. Fallen trees blocked the path every few yards, and the beam of her flashlight seemed to be swallowed by the darkness just feet ahead. But Rachel pressed on, driven by a desperate need for answers. The cemetery gates hung broken and twisted. The storm had torn through the graveyard like a cosmic lawnmower, uprooting headstones and scattering them across the muddy ground. But it wasn't the destruction that made Rachel's blood freeze. It was the holes, dozens of them, perfect rectangular pits where coffins should have been. The earth around each grave was soft and fresh, as if something had clawed its way up from below. And leading away from each empty grave were tracks in the mud. Footprints, human footprints, heading in all directions away from the cemetery. Rachel's phone buzzed. A new voicemail. Grandma Rose received now. Rachel, dear, I can see you standing there. You came to visit us after all. How thoughtful. But visiting hours are over now. It's time to come home with us. Rachel spun around, her flashlight cutting wild arcs through the darkness. Nothing. Just trees and shadows, and the sound of her own ragged breathing. Another buzz. Dad received now. Behind you, RACH. Rachel whirled around, nearly dropping the flashlight. In its pale beam, she could make out a figure standing between two broken headstones. Tall and familiar, wearing the same flannel shirt her father had died in. But his face was wrong. Too pale, too sunken, with eyes that reflected the light like a nocturnal animal's. "Dad," she whispered. The figure took a step forward, its movement stiff and unnatural. "I told you not to come here, RACH, but you never were good at listening." More figures emerged from the shadows. Rachel recognized them all. Neighbors, friends, relatives, all dead, all moving with that same jerky, puppet-like gait. Their eyes gleamed in the flashlight beam, and when they opened their mouths to speak, their voices came not from their throats, but from Rachel's phone. The voicemails were still playing, all of them at once, a cacophony of dead voices speaking in overlapping whispers. "Come with us, Rachel. You don't belong with the living anymore." The storm broke the rules. Now we can all be together. Forever and ever and ever. Rachel raised the rifle with trembling hands. "Stay back. You're not real. You're all dead." Her grandmother's corpse tilted its head at an impossible angle. "Oh, sweetheart, death is just another kind of phone service, and the storm gave us such a strong signal." The dead began to close in. Rachel fired the rifle into the air, the gunshot echoing across the cemetery. But the figures didn't even flinch. They continued their slow, inevitable approach, their phone-generated voices growing louder and more insistent. Rachel turned and ran. She crashed through the forest, branches tearing at her clothes and face. Behind her, she could hear them following, not running, but walking with steady, patient steps. They had all the time in the world now. She burst out of the tree line and sprinted toward her house, her lungs burning. Just as she reached the front porch, her phone buzzed one final time. The caller ID made her heart stop. Rachel Winters received now. Her own name, her own number. With trembling fingers, she played the message. Her own voice emerged from the speaker, but it carried that same hollow, distant quality as all the others. "Rachel, this is you calling. Well, you that will be calling soon. I wanted to let you know that we're almost home. The living and the dead don't have to be separate anymore. The storm made sure of that. So don't be afraid when you see us at your door. Don't be afraid when your heart stops beating and your breath grows cold, because you'll still be able to call. You'll still be able to reach out and touch someone. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that what you always wanted? To never lose touch with the people you love." The message ended with the sound of Rachel's own laughter, but distorted and wrong, like a recording played backwards. Rachel looked up to see them emerging from the forest. Dozens of corpses, all walking toward her house with that same patient determination. Her family, her friends, her neighbors, all the people she had ever loved and lost. And at the front of the group, leading them like some grotesque parade, was herself, or rather, what she would become. Her future corpse smiled and waved, its dead eyes glinting in the porch light. Rachel's phone began to ring. The caller ID showed her own name. She answered without thinking. "Hello, Rachel." Her own dead voice whispered through the speaker. "We're here." The figures reached the porch steps. Rachel backed against her front door, but it was locked and her hands were shaking too badly to find her keys. "Don't you want to stay connected?" her grandmother's corpse asked, tilting its head with a wet, snapping sound. "Don't you want unlimited minutes with unlimited loved ones?" "The family plan," her father's corpse added with a grinding laugh. "Death included." Rachel felt her chest tighten. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps. The phone in her hand grew impossibly cold, frost forming on its surface. The dead voices continued to pour from its speaker, a chorus of everything she had ever loved and lost. "Join us, Rachel. The signal is so strong now. You'll never be alone again. Never out of touch. Never disconnected." Rachel's vision darkened at the edges. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird, then began to slow. The phone slipped from her numb fingers and clattered to the wooden porch. As consciousness faded, she heard one final sound, the chime of a new voicemail being recorded. The next morning, when the first rescue teams finally reached Whitmore Creek, they found Rachel Winters sitting on her front porch. She appeared to be sleeping peacefully, her phone clutched in her dead hands. The coroner later determined that she had died of cardiac arrest, brought on by extreme stress and terror. But what puzzled the investigators was the condition of her phone. Despite the cell towers being completely destroyed, the device was still receiving messages. The voicemail inbox showed 347 unheard messages, all from numbers that belonged to deceased residents of Whitmore Creek. And as they watched, more messages kept arriving. The final entry in the police report noted an unusual detail. Every few hours, the phone would automatically dial random numbers throughout the region. When people answered these calls, they heard only static and distant, hollow voices whispering their names. The phone was eventually destroyed, but by then it was too late. The calls had already spread. In towns across Montana, Wyoming, and North Dakota, people began receiving voicemails from their own dead relatives. The messages always started the same way. "I know you can hear me. There's something you need to know about the storm." It opened something that should have stayed closed. And in every town where the calls were received, people began to die of sudden cardiac arrest, always with their phones in their hands, always with 47 new voicemails waiting. The telecommunications companies tried to trace the source of the calls, but the signals seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere at once. Some technicians reported that the voice data contained impossible acoustic properties, as if the sound waves were traveling through spaces that didn't exist in the physical world. One engineer, Thomas Bradley from Vancouver, became obsessed with decoding the messages. He worked for weeks, analyzing the audio patterns and frequency modulations. Just before his own mysterious death, he sent a final email to his colleagues. "The voices aren't using our networks. They're using something else, something older. The electromagnetic fields generated by human consciousness don't simply disappear when we die. They linger, they echo, and sometimes, when the conditions are just right, those echoes can find a way back to the living world." The storm in Whitmore Creek created the perfect atmospheric conditions for this phenomenon. But now that the pathway has been opened, it's spreading. The dead have found a way to stay connected. Bradley's body was found 3 days later in his laboratory, his phone still ringing with calls from his deceased parents. The last verified incident occurred 6 months after the Whitmore Creek event. A family in Melbourne, Australia, received a call from their daughter, who had died in a car accident 2 years earlier. The message was brief. "Mom, Dad, I just wanted to let you know that I'm okay. We all are, and we're expanding our coverage area. Soon, everyone will have service. Everyone will be connected. Death won't be the end of the conversation anymore. Isn't that wonderful?" The phone companies eventually developed filters to block the anomalous calls, but people receiving them. Late at night, when the electromagnetic interference is at its strongest, phones will ring with calls from the dead. They say if you listen carefully to the static on old radio frequencies, you can still hear them. Hundreds of voices, all talking at once, all trying to place a call to the world of the living, all trying to stay connected. And sometimes, on nights when the atmosphere is just right, when storms roll across the mountains and valleys, the dead remember how to dial. The service never truly ends. It just changes providers. The first time Marcus Webb noticed something wrong with his house in Portland, Oregon, he blamed it on exhaustion. After all, working double shifts at the lumber mill for 3 months straight would make anyone see things that weren't there. But when he walked into his kitchen that rainy Tuesday morning and found the refrigerator where his stove should have been, he knew something was terribly and possibly wrong. The rain had been falling for 6 days straight, turning the streets of Portland into rivers and the sky into a perpetual gray shroud. Marcus had inherited the Victorian house on ELM Street from his great-aunt Helen, a woman he barely remembered, but who had left him her only valuable possession, along with a cryptic note. The house remembers everything, but only when it weeps. At first, he dismissed the note as the ramblings of an old woman. Now, standing in his impossibly rearranged kitchen, the words echoed in his mind like a funeral bell. The stove was where the kitchen table should have been. The sink had somehow migrated to the corner where his coffee maker usually sat. Even the windows seemed different, smaller somehow, as if the house was slowly closing its eyes. The rain drummed against the glass with an almost rhythmic persistence, like fingers tapping impatiently on a desk. Marcus rubbed his eyes, certain he was hallucinating, but when he opened them again, everything remained wrong. He stumbled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs, and noticed something else that made his blood run cold. There were wet footprints on the kitchen floor. Small, bare footprints that definitely weren't his, leading from the back door to where the stove now stood, then simply stopping. He grabbed his cell phone with trembling fingers, but there was no signal. There never was during the heavy rains in this part of Portland. The landline was dead too, which wasn't unusual given the old wiring in the house. But as he stood there, listening to the static hiss of the disconnected phone, he heard something else underneath the sound of the rain. Whispering. Soft, urgent whispers that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. He pressed his ear against the kitchen wall, and the whispers grew clearer, though the words remained incomprehensible. They sounded like warnings, like desperate pleas, like the final words of people who had run out of time. Marcus backed away from the wall, his breathing quick and shallow. He needed to get out of the house, needed to think clearly, but when he turned toward the front door, his heart nearly stopped. The hallway had stretched. What had been a simple 10-foot corridor from the kitchen to the front door was now a long, shadowy tunnel that seemed to extend far beyond where the front door should have been. The walls appeared to pulse gently, like the inside of some massive throat, and the whispers were getting louder. He ran toward where the door should have been, but with each step, the hallway seemed to grow longer. His footsteps echoed strangely, as if he were running through a vast cavern instead of his modest home. The whispers became a chorus now, dozens of voices overlapping in urgent, frightened tones, and underneath it all, he heard something else, a low, rumbling sound, like something enormous breathing. Finally, gasping and panicked, he reached what should have been his front door, but instead of the familiar red-painted wood and brass handle, he found only blank wall. The door was gone, as if it had never existed at all. Marcus pounded on the wall with his fists, screaming for help, but the sound was muffled, absorbed by the house itself. He spun around, desperate, and saw that the hallway behind him had changed again. Now there were doors, dozens of them, lining both walls, all slightly ajar and revealing only impenetrable darkness beyond. The rain outside grew heavier, and with each intensification of the storm, Marcus could feel the house changing around him. The walls shifted subtly, floors tilted at impossible angles, and new rooms appeared where none had been before. The house was alive, and it was hungry. He tried one of the new doors, hoping it might lead to an exit, but found himself in a room he'd never seen before. It was filled with old photographs, hundreds of them, covering every surface. As he looked closer, his blood turned to ice. They were all pictures of people in this very house, spent what looked like decades, and in every single photograph, the people looked terrified. There was a young woman in a 1950s dress, her eyes wide with horror as she stood in what Marcus now recognized as his living room, though the furniture was completely different. There was an elderly man from the 1970s, backed against a wall that Marcus had never seen in his house, his face frozen in a silent scream. And there were dozens more, men, women, even children, all trapped in moments of absolute terror. At the center of the collection was a photograph that made Marcus's knees buckle. It was his great-aunt Helen, but she looked decades younger than he remembered. She was standing in his kitchen, but it wasn't his kitchen. It was some twisted version of it, with walls that curved inward and a ceiling that seemed to drip with something dark and viscous. And behind her, barely visible in the shadows, was a shape that wasn't quite human. Marcus grabbed the photograph with shaking hands and noticed writing on the back, "The house feeds on fear and trapped souls when the rain falls heavy. I try to warn them all, but the house wouldn't let me." I'm so sorry, Marcus. Run while you still can. But even as he read the words, Marcus knew it was too late. The rain outside had become a torrential downpour, and the house was changing faster now. The room spun around him like a carnival ride, the photographs blurring together until they formed a kaleidoscope of terror. The whispers had become screams, and he realized with horror that they were coming from the people in the photographs, the souls that the house had collected over the years. He stumbled out of the photograph room and found himself in a corridor he'd never seen before, lined with mirrors that reflected not his image, but the terrified faces from the photographs. Each mirror showed a different person, a different era, but all sharing the same expression of hopeless fear. The house shuddered around him, and Marcus realized that it was feeding, drawing strength from his terror. Every frightened heartbeat, every panicked breath was nourishment for whatever malevolent entity had taken residence in his inherited home. The rain wasn't just weather, it was the house's feeding time, when it grew strong enough to trap new souls. He ran through corridor after corridor, each one different from the last, each one leading him deeper into the house's twisted interior. Rooms appeared and disappeared, staircases led to ceilings, and doors opened onto walls. The house was a maze now, a living puzzle designed to confuse and terrorize its prey. In one room, he found children's toys scattered across the floor, but they were old and rotted, as if they'd been there for decades. In another, he discovered a dining room set for a family dinner, but the food on the plates had turned to dust, and the chairs were pulled out as if the diners had fled in panic. The whispers followed him everywhere, getting louder and more urgent. Sometimes he could almost make out words. "Help us," and "Don't let it take you," and "The rain makes it stronger." But no matter how fast he ran, or how many rooms he searched, he couldn't find a way out. Hours seemed to pass, though Marcus couldn't be sure. The house had no clocks now, no windows that showed the outside world. Time had become as twisted as the architecture. He was exhausted, his clothes soaked with sweat and terror, when he finally stumbled into a room that stopped him cold. It was an exact replica of his bedroom, down to the unmade bed and the coffee-stained mug on his nightstand. But sitting on the bed, with its back to him, was a figure in a rotted dress that he recognized from one of the photographs. "You can't escape," the figure said without turning around. Its voice was like autumn leaves rustling in the wind. "I tried for 40 years. The rain calls to it, feeds it, makes it strong, and when it's strong enough, it changes." The figure finally turned, and Marcus saw that it was his great Aunt Helen, but not as she'd been in life. Her face was pale and drawn, her eyes hollow and filled with sadness. She was translucent, like morning mist, and through her body he could see the wall behind. "I never left," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "None of us did. We're all still here, trapped in its belly, fuel for its hunger. I tried to warn you in the note, but I knew you wouldn't understand. No one ever does, until it's too late." Marcus tried to speak, but his throat felt like it was filled with sand. Finally, he managed to croak out, "How do I get out?" Helen's ghostly form smiled sadly. "You don't. The house doesn't let go of what it catches. But maybe you can fight it. The rain is its strength, but it's also its weakness. The house only changes when it rains, because that's when the barrier between worlds is thinnest. If you can find the heart of the house, the place where it all began, maybe you can break the cycle." "Where?" Marcus gasped. "The basement," Helen replied, her form already beginning to fade. "It was always the basement. That's where he built it. That's where he made the bargain. But be careful, Marcus. The deeper you go, the hungrier it gets." And then she was gone, leaving Marcus alone in the mockery of his bedroom. The basement. In all his months living in the house, he'd never been to the basement. Every time he thought about exploring down there, something had stopped him. A feeling of unease, a sense that some places were better left undisturbed. Now he understood why. He left the bedroom and began searching for stairs leading down. The house fought him every step of the way, corridors shifting and changing, stairs appearing and disappearing. But Marcus pressed on, driven by a desperate hope. that Helen had been right. Finally, after what felt like hours of searching, he saw them. Narrow wooden stairs descending into absolute darkness. The whispers grew quieter as he approached, as if even the trapped souls were afraid of what lay below. The rain outside grew even heavier, and with each step down, Marcus could feel the house's malevolent attention focusing on him. The walls pressed in closer, and the darkness seemed to have weight, pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. At the bottom of the stairs, he found himself in a basement that couldn't possibly fit under his house. It was enormous, stretching away into shadows that his eyes couldn't penetrate. The floor was dirt, but not ordinary earth. It was black and seemed to move slightly, as if something was writhing just beneath the surface. In the center of the basement was a circle of stones, and within that circle stood a wooden post with iron chains wrapped around it. The chains were old and rusted, but they hummed with some kind of dark energy. And carved into the post, in letters that seemed to bleed in the dim light, were words in a language Marcus didn't recognize. But as he approached the circle, the words began to change, shifting and rearranging themselves until they formed English. Let the hungry earth feast on fear. Let the dwelling drink deep of sorrow. In rain shall it walk, in terror shall it feed, until the last soul is claimed. Marcus understood now. Someone generations ago had made a deal with something ancient and evil. They had bound a hungry entity to this place, giving it the power to trap and feed on human souls in exchange for what? Wealth? Power? It didn't matter now. What mattered was that Marcus could feel the binding weakening. The constant rain was washing away the salt circles, the protective symbols, all the safeguards that had kept the entity merely trapped instead of free to roam the world. He grabbed the chains, and immediately pain shot through his arms like lightning. The metal was ice cold and seemed to burn his skin, but he held on. If he could break the binding, maybe the entity would be forced back to wherever it had come from. Maybe all the trapped souls would finally be free. The house began to shake violently. Plaster rained down from the ceiling, and the whispers became a roar of voices, some pleading with him to stop, others urging him on. The entity was fighting back, using every ounce of its power to stop him. Marcus pulled harder on the chains, and one of them snapped with a sound like thunder. The house screamed, an inhuman sound that seemed to come from every wall, every floorboard, every nail and screw that held the structure together. Another chain broke, then another. With each severed link, the house shuddered more violently, and Marcus could see cracks appearing in the basement walls. Through the cracks came not light, but a swirling darkness that seemed hungry and alive. The final chain snapped just as the basement ceiling began to collapse. Marcus dove away from the circle as massive wooden beams crashed down where he'd been standing. The entity's scream became a roar of rage and pain, and then suddenly everything was silent. Marcus found himself lying on wet grass, the rain falling gently on his face. He sat up slowly, his body aching, and looked around in confusion. He was in his backyard in Portland, but where his house had stood, there was now just an empty lot filled with blackened timbers and twisted metal. The house was gone, not burned, not demolished, but simply gone, as if it had never existed at all. As the rain began to lighten, Marcus saw them, translucent figures walking away into the morning mist. Helen was among them, and she turned back to give him a sad smile and a nod of gratitude before disappearing forever. The entity was gone too, banished back to whatever dark realm it had come from. The binding was broken, the bargain void, and all the souls that had collected over the decades were finally free. Marcus stood up on shaking legs and walked to the street. His neighbors were already coming out to stare at the empty lot where his house had been, talking in confused whispers about how they could have sworn there was a Victorian house there just yesterday. But Marcus didn't stop to explain. He had nothing left now except the clothes on his back and the knowledge that some hungers are too terrible to ever be satisfied, some bargains too evil to ever be worth their price. As he walked away from ELM Street, the rain finally stopped, and for the first time in days, the sun broke through the clouds. Behind him, the empty lot where his inherited house had stood was already beginning to sprout with new grass, as if the earth itself was eager to forget what had happened there. Marcus never returned to Portland, but sometimes, on rainy nights in whatever city he found himself in, he would dream of whispers in the walls and rooms that shifted when no one was looking, and he would wake with the absolute certainty that somewhere, in some other inherited house, some other unsuspecting relative was about to discover that buildings can be hungry, and rain can be a dinner bell for things that should never be fed. The house that changed in the rain was gone, but the memory of its terrible appetite would haunt Marcus Webb for the rest of his life. And sometimes, just sometimes, he wondered if breaking the binding had truly destroyed the entity, or if it had simply freed it to find a new dwelling, a new feeding ground, a new family to terrorize when the storms rolled in, because some hungers, once awakened, never truly die. They just find new ways to feed.